Before Assyria became the most feared empire of the ancient world, before its kings carved scenes of conquest into stone, before its armies smashed city walls, before defeated rulers were dragged in chains, before Nineveh became a city of palaces and libraries, before the name Assyria made enemies tremble from the mountains of Anatolia to the Nile Valley of Egypt, it began as something much smaller. A city, not a huge empire, not an unstoppable war machine. Just a city on the Tigris River in northern Mesopotamia called Ashur. And at first, if you had walked through Ashur in its early days, you may not have guessed that this place would one day terrify the ancient Near East. You would have seen merchants, priests, families, scribes, traders, donkeys carrying goods, temples rising above mud-brick streets, and boats moving along the river. You would have heard the sound of bargaining, prayers, animals, pottery, footsteps, and clay tablets being pressed with signs. You would have smelled river mud, smoke, grain, wool, oil, leather, and dust. It was not yet the center of a giant empire. It was a trading city, a sacred city, a city watching the roads and rivers of northern Mesopotamia. But hidden inside Ashur was something powerful, a god, a name, a memory, and a hunger that would grow slowly across centuries. The god of the city was also called Ashur. That matters. In Assyria, city, god, and kingdom were deeply connected. Ashur was not only a place. Ashur was divine power. To serve the city was to serve the god. To expand the kingdom was, in the minds of later Assyrian kings, to expand the order of Ashur himself. This is one of the keys to understanding Assyria. They did not simply conquer because they wanted land. They conquered because kings could present conquest as a sacred duty. Enemies were not just political rivals. They were people refusing the rightful order of the god. That idea would become terrifying later, but not yet. At the beginning, Ashur's strength was trade. The early Assyrians were skilled merchants. Long before their armies became famous, their merchants traveled far from home into Anatolia, especially to the trading colony at Lachish. They carried textiles and tin, and they returned with silver and other goods. They wrote letters on clay tablets. These letters were not grand royal speeches. They were business messages, complaints, contracts, family arguments, debt records, shipping instructions, and practical worries. They show us a very human Assyria before the empire of terror. Husbands writing to wives, merchants worrying about profit, partners accusing each other of dishonesty, caravans moving through dangerous roads, taxes being paid, goods being delayed. Imagine an Assyrian merchant preparing to leave Ashur. He stands near a caravan of donkeys loaded with textiles and tin. The journey ahead is long. The roads toward Anatolia are not safe. Bandits may attack. Local rulers may demand tolls. Weather may turn. A partner may cheat him. A debt may go unpaid, but the profit could be worth it. His family depends on it. His status depends on it. His city depends on these networks. So he seals tablets, checks goods, speaks with other merchants, and begins the journey north. This is the Assyria most people do not imagine. Not soldiers first, merchants first, writers first, network builders first, but trade teaches a city many things. It teaches roads, it teaches distance, it teaches negotiation, it teaches the value of information, it teaches how wealth moves. It teaches where metal comes from, where silver can be found, which rulers are weak, which roads are dangerous, which cities are rich, and which regions matter. The Assyrians learned the map before they conquered the map, and you will see later why that mattered. Because when Assyria eventually turned fully toward empire, it already understood routes, logistics, distance, and administration better than most. A war machine is not built only with swords. It is built with roads, records, food, messengers, discipline, and the ability to make distant lands obey. Ashur's early life was shaped by its geography. Northern Mesopotamia was different from southern Mesopotamia. The south had ancient cities like Ur, Uruk, Nippur, and Babylon, built in a land of canals, rivers, and old traditions. The north was closer to mountains, highlands, trade routes, and dangerous frontiers. Assyria sat between worlds. To the south lay Babylonia, older, richer in cultural prestige, famous for learning, temples, kings, and scribal tradition. To the north and east were mountains and peoples who could raid, resist, or trade. To the west were routes toward Syria, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean. Assyria was not protected by endless deserts like Egypt. It was exposed, and exposure can create hardness. A city that feels safe may grow slow and ceremonial. A city that feels surrounded learns to organize. For much of its history, Assyria lived between greater powers. Sometimes it was independent. Sometimes it was pressured by stronger kingdoms. Sometimes it expanded. Sometimes it shrank. It was not always the terrifying empire we remember. It had to survive long centuries of rivalry, invasion, political weakness, and foreign domination. That survival shaped its character. The Assyrians learned that weakness invited attack. They learned that if they did not dominate the roots around them, others might dominate them. They learned that fear could be a weapon, but they learned this gradually, painfully, over time. In early Mesopotamian history, southern powers often held cultural prestige. Babylon especially would become the city Assyrians both admired and resented. This relationship is important. Assyria and Babylonia shared languages, gods, writing traditions, myths, and cultural roots, but they were not the same. Babylon was old, sacred, and prestigious. Assyria was northern, harsher, more militarized over time, and deeply ambitious. Assyrian kings often wanted Babylon's respect, but Babylon did not easily submit in spirit. This tension between Assyria and Babylon will come back again and again in our story, and when it finally explodes, it will become one of the darkest chapters of the empire. But we are not there yet. For now, Ashur is still growing. The city's political life changed across centuries. There were periods of local rulers, merchant influence, and kingship. Eventually, Assyrian kings began to build stronger state structures. One early powerful figure was Shamshi-Adad I, who ruled in the early 2nd millennium BC and created a large northern Mesopotamian kingdom. He was not originally from Ashur in the simple local sense, but he took control and built a powerful realm with Ashur as part of his world. His kingdom stretched across major regions, and his letters show a ruler deeply concerned with administration, family politics, military campaigns, and control of distant cities. Shamshi-Adad's rule gives us a glimpse of what Assyria could become: organized, ambitious, strategic. But after his death, his kingdom weakened. That pattern would repeat in Mesopotamian history many times. A strong ruler expands, his successors struggle. Rivals return, vassals rebel. The map changes again. Ancient states often depended heavily on the personal strength of kings. Institutions mattered, but the ruler's energy, intelligence, and military success mattered enormously. Assyria had not yet found the permanent imperial machine it would later become. It was still learning. Centuries passed. Powers rose and fell around it. The great kingdom of Mitanni dominated much of northern Mesopotamia and Syria during part of the Late Bronze Age, and Assyria at times fell under Mitanni influence. Imagine what that meant emotionally for Assyrian elites. The city of Ashur, sacred to its god, proud of its traditions, forced to live under the shadow of another power. Such periods of subordination can leave deep marks. They can create resentment. They can create memory. They can create future ambition. A people that has been dominated may later decide never to be dominated again. That does not excuse what Assyria would become, but it helps explain the hardness behind its expansion. Later, as Mitanni weakened under pressure from the Hittites and others, Assyria began to rise again. Kings like Ashur-uballit I helped restore Assyrian independence and prestige. Assyria entered the Late Bronze Age international system as a serious power. Its kings wrote to Egypt. They dealt with Babylonia. They claimed status among great rulers. But Assyria was still not yet the massive empire of later centuries. It was powerful, yes, but still one player among many in a world where Egypt, Hatti, Babylonia, and other powers mattered. Then came the great collapse of the Bronze Age world. The Hittite Empire fell, Ugarit burned, Mycenaean palaces collapsed, sea routes broke, Egypt survived but weakened, and Assyria, unlike many others, endured. This is one of the turning points. Assyria did not simply rise because it was strong, it also rose because others fell. Old Bronze Age order broke apart, and in the Iron Age world that followed, Assyria slowly became one of the powers best able to take advantage of the new reality. But even Assyria suffered difficult periods. It did not march smoothly from survival to world empire. There were setbacks, weak kings, pressure from Aramean tribes, loss of territory, and internal problems. The early Iron Age was hard. Many states were adjusting to new conditions. Trade patterns had changed. Populations moved. Local kingdoms formed. Aramean groups spread across Syria and Mesopotamia. Assyria found itself fighting not only old-style kingdoms but mobile, resilient groups who could pressure the countryside and disrupt control. This is another key to understanding Assyria. The Empire of Terror was born from fear of disorder. Assyrian kings came to see the world around them as dangerous, rebellious, and unstable. Mountains sheltered enemies, deserts sheltered raiders, cities withheld tribute, vassals betrayed oaths, tribes moved across borders, Babylon resisted. The west was full of rich but slippery kingdoms. The north held Urartu, a powerful rival in the mountains. The east held highland peoples. The south held Babylonian prestige and rebellion. From the Assyrian point of view, security required domination. They did not want just victory. They wanted submission, not just submission today, submission remembered tomorrow. This is why later Assyrian warfare became so psychologically brutal. It was not random cruelty, it was policy. A city that resisted had to become an example. A king who rebelled had to be humiliated publicly. A population that threatened control could be deported and resettled elsewhere. Reliefs showing siege, punishment, and conquest were not merely decoration. They were messages: resist Assyria and this is what happens. But again, that comes later. You will see how that machine becomes fully formed under rulers like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal. For now, we are watching the early roots of it. In the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, one of the great Assyrian rulers was Tiglath-Pileser I, who ruled around the late 2nd millennium and early 1st millennium BC. He campaigned widely, hunted animals, defeated enemies, and projected Assyrian power across regions. His inscriptions already show the style that later Assyrian kings would sharpen. The king as unstoppable warrior, chosen by the gods, crushing enemies, crossing mountains, receiving tribute, terrifying rebels. He campaigned into Syria and reached the Mediterranean. He boasted of hunting wild bulls and lions. He wanted to present himself as a ruler of extraordinary strength. The lion hunt is important. To modern eyes, royal hunting may seem like sport, but in Assyria, hunting lions became symbolic of kingship. The lion represented wild chaos, danger, and violent nature. The king who killed lions showed that he could master chaos. Later Assyrian palace reliefs would make lion hunt some of the most powerful images in ancient art. The wounded lions are carved with terrifying beauty. The king stands calm, controlled, dominant. The message is clear: as the king conquers the lion, he conquers disorder. And Assyria's deepest fear was disorder. Imagine Tiglath-Pileser I standing in a royal hunt. The lion charges, muscles tense, mouth open, mane wild. Guards stand ready, but the king must appear fearless. His bow is drawn. The animal becomes more than an animal. It becomes the world beyond control: mountains, rebels, enemies, famine, invasion, everything that threatens the ordered land of Ashur. When the king kills it, he performs kingship itself. The court watches, scribes remember, artists later carve. The king has shown that he can face chaos and live. But after Tiglath-Pileser I, Assyria again faced decline. Aramean pressure and wider instability reduced Assyrian control. This is important because it shows the empire was not inevitable. Assyria could have remained a regional kingdom. It could have faded like others. It could have become just another old name in Mesopotamian records. Instead, it recovered. Why? Because Assyria developed a culture of military organization, administrative memory, and royal ideology that allowed repeated revival. It had a strong sense of identity centered on Ashur. It had a tradition of kingship tied to divine mission. It had scribal systems. It had a heartland capable of producing disciplined armies. It had experience dealing with difficult frontiers. And over time, especially in the 1st millennium BC, it transformed warfare into a state system more efficient and terrifying than anything before it. But before we reach the great new Assyrian Empire, we must understand the spiritual heart of the Assyrian state. Ashur the god was not like a distant decorative patron. He was the empire's divine owner. Later Assyrian kings often described campaigns as being commanded by Ashur. The king was the god's chosen servant. Conquest was not merely personal ambition, it was obedience. This gave Assyrian expansion a sacred intensity. When the king marched, he marched in the name of the god. When enemies resisted, they resisted divine order. When tribute was collected, it flowed into the system of Ashur. When lands were conquered, the god's domain expanded. This idea made Assyrian kings dangerous because it fused religion, politics, and war into one mission. A normal king might stop after securing borders. A king serving an imperial god could always find another land that should submit. The Assyrian state also learned to use fear openly. Many empires use fear, but Assyria made fear visible. Their inscriptions could be brutally detailed. They described cities destroyed, rebels punished, bodies displayed, rulers humiliated. These descriptions were not meant to make Assyria look kind. They were meant to make Assyria look unstoppable. In the ancient world, reputation traveled. If a city heard what happened to another city that resisted, it might surrender without a fight. Terror could save Assyrian resources by preventing rebellion. This is where we must be honest. Assyria was brilliant, organized, and culturally rich, but it was also extremely violent. To tell its story properly, we cannot soften that. The Assyrians built libraries, temples, palaces, roads, and administrative systems. They preserved knowledge. They produced some of the most extraordinary relief art of the ancient world. They created one of the most sophisticated empires before Persia and Rome. But they also deported populations, destroyed rebellious cities, and used public brutality as a political language. That contradiction is the Assyrian story: civilization and terror, libraries and siege engines, scholar kings and mass deportations, palace art and burning cities, order and fear. You will see later how this reaches its peak in Nineveh, where Ashurbanipal gathers knowledge from across Mesopotamia while his empire crushes enemies with ruthless force. A king can collect ancient myths and still destroy cities. A library can stand inside an empire built by terror. History is not comfortable. For now, we return to the small city of Ashur and the long road from trade to empire. Its early merchants could not have imagined every future horror and achievement. They cared about tin, textiles, silver, debts, caravans, letters, and family businesses. But they helped create habits that Assyria would later use: long-distance communication, record-keeping, practical calculation, and knowledge of roots. The city's god gave Assyria a sacred identity. Its exposed geography gave it a defensive hardness. Its periods of subordination gave it ambition. Its kings developed the ideology of conquest. Its enemies taught it that survival required force. Slowly across centuries, the pieces came together: a sacred city, a merchant tradition, a harsh frontier, a warrior kingship, a memory of humiliation, a god of empire, a talent for records, a belief that rebellion must be crushed so completely that others remember. And then when the Bronze Age world collapsed and the Iron Age opened, Assyria was ready, not immediately, not without setbacks, but ready in a way many others were not. As this first part of the Assyrian story settles into darkness, picture Ashur at night. The Tigris River moves quietly below the city. In the temple, offerings are made to the god Ashur. A merchant seals a tablet before a long journey north. A young soldier sharpens a blade near a gate. A scribe presses signs into wet clay. A priest speaks words older than memory. Beyond the walls, the road stretched toward mountains, deserts, Babylonia, Syria, Anatolia, and lands that will one day know Assyrian armies. For now, the city is still small compared with the empire it will become. But the future is already there, hidden in its streets. The river, the tablets, the god, the fear of enemies, the hunger for security, the belief that order must be imposed. One day, Assyria will rise from this city and build an empire so powerful that kings from distant lands will send tribute. Cities will surrender at the sound of its approach, and enemies will carve Assyria into their nightmares. But every empire begins before the world is afraid of it. Assyria began as Ashur, and Ashur was watching. Ashur was not only the name of a city. Ashur was the name of a god, and that single fact changes everything about the Assyrian story. In many ancient kingdoms, a city had a patron deity. A god protected the walls, watched the people, received offerings, and gave identity to the community. But in Assyria, the bond between city, god, king, and empire became unusually intense. Ashur was the divine heart of the state. He was the sacred owner of the land. He was the power behind the throne. He was the reason kings could claim that conquest was not merely ambition, but duty. When later Assyrian armies marched across mountains and deserts, when cities surrendered in terror, when tribute poured into royal palaces, when rebels were punished with brutal public violence, the kings did not present these things as personal greed alone. They presented them as the work of Ashur. The empire was not just expanding Assyrian control. It was expanding the order of the god. This is why Assyria became different from many earlier powers. Every empire wants land, wealth, labor, prestige, and security, but Assyria turned those desires into a sacred mission. The king was not simply a warrior with a crown. He was the servant of Ashur, chosen to bring rebellious lands into submission. In Assyrian royal ideology, the world outside obedience could be described as disorder, and the king's task was to crush that disorder. The enemy was not only an enemy of Assyria, the enemy was an enemy of the divine order that Ashur had commanded the king to enforce. That belief gave Assyrian warfare a frightening moral certainty. A king who believes conquest is his god's will does not easily stop at a border. But this sacred mission did not appear fully formed in one day. It grew from the city's long memory. Ashur had begun as a powerful religious and commercial center. Its merchants traveled far, its scribes wrote carefully, its rulers watched stronger kingdoms rise around them. Sometimes Assyria stood independent, sometimes it was pressured, reduced, or overshadowed. Through it all, the city's identity remained tied to its god. The god gave continuity when politics shifted. A king could die, a dynasty could weaken. A foreign power could dominate for a time, but Ashur remained, the temple remained, the idea of a chosen city remained, and when Assyria rose again, that old sacred identity became the foundation for something much larger. Imagine the temple of Ashur in the early morning. The city is still dim, the Tigris moves beyond the walls, priests enter the sacred space with offerings, oil lamps flicker, incense rises, bread, beer, animals, precious goods, and ritual words are prepared for the god. Outside, merchants discuss caravans, soldiers guard the gates. Scribes prepare tablets, but inside the temple the city speaks to the divine power it believes protects and defines it. Ashur is not distant. Ashur is present in the heart of the city. Every success belongs to him. Every failure may require explanation before him. Every king must stand beneath him. To become king of Assyria was therefore not only to inherit a throne, it was to accept a sacred burden. The king had to feed the gods, maintain temples, lead armies, judge disputes, punish enemies, restore order, build palaces, dig canals, protect borders, and bring wealth home. If he failed, the failure was not only political, it could be religious. It could mean that he had not properly served Ashur. The king's body, his weapons, his crown, his inscriptions, his hunts, his battles, and his building projects all became part of a public argument. I am the rightful servant of the god. I have fulfilled my duty. I have made Assyria strong. This is why Assyrian royal inscriptions sound so intense. The king does not merely say, I campaigned against this city. He says the great gods commanded him. He says enemies rebelled against divine order. He says he marched with terrifying force. He lists tribute, captives, destroyed cities, defeated kings, mountains crossed, rivers conquered, lands subdued. To modern ears, the boasting can feel excessive, but the purpose was clear. The inscription was not only a record, it was a performance of legitimacy. It told gods, nobles, soldiers, foreign rulers, and future kings that this ruler had done what Assyrian kings were supposed to do. And what were they supposed to do? Expand, punish, build, control. Remember, Assyria's obsession with memory is important. The kings carved their campaigns into stone. They stored tablets. They built palaces decorated with scenes of conquest and royal power. They wanted victory to last beyond the battlefield. Fear had to travel farther than the army. A city that had never seen Assyrian soldiers might still hear what happened to another city that resisted. A ruler might decide to pay tribute not because Assyria was at his gate today, but because he had heard what Assyria did yesterday. This was not accidental. It was strategy. Assyria understood that reputation could become a weapon. The Assyrians also understood that empire needed administration. Terror alone cannot run a state. Fear can break resistance, but someone still has to collect tribute, appoint governors, move armies, maintain roads, relocate populations, store supplies, send messages, and keep records. The genius of Assyria was that it combined brutality with bureaucracy. Its kings could be terrifying on campaign, but behind the terror stood a highly organized system of provinces, officials, messengers, scribes, military logistics, and royal oversight. That combination made Assyria far more dangerous than a raiding kingdom. Raiders can destroy. Assyria could destroy and then govern. The god Ashur stood above this system as its sacred justification. When tribute came from distant lands, it was not only wealth for the king. It was wealth brought into the domain of Ashur. When foreign peoples were deported and resettled, it was not described only as practical control, though it was deeply practical. It was also part of reshaping the world under Assyrian order. When a rebellious city was punished, the punishment taught others what happened when they refused the god's chosen king. This is where Assyria becomes uncomfortable. Many ancient empires were violent, but Assyria made violence unusually visible. It did not hide terror, it advertised it. Royal inscriptions describe punishments in detail. Palace reliefs show sieges, deportations, captives, soldiers, tribute bearers, and defeated enemies. To modern viewers, these images can feel horrifying, but to Assyrian elites, they were proof of order. A city that rebelled had chosen chaos. The king restored order by making rebellion unforgettable. This does not mean Assyrians were uniquely evil people in some simple way. That would be too shallow. They were human beings shaped by their world, their fears, their traditions, their gods, and their political needs. They built families, worshipped, traded, wrote, farmed, loved, feared, and died like everyone else. Assyrian cruelty was not because every Assyrian was personally monstrous. It was because the state developed a political language in which extreme violence was considered legitimate, useful, and sacredly approved. That is more disturbing, not less. It shows how ordinary human societies can build systems where terror becomes policy. The Assyrians had reason to fear disorder. Their homeland sat in a dangerous position. Mountains, tribes, rival kingdoms, Babylonian resistance, Western coalitions, northern enemies, and shifting frontiers surrounded them. Assyria's rulers came to believe that safety could only come through domination. If a neighboring kingdom remained independent, it might become a threat. If a vassal was too free, he might rebel. If a city rebelled once and was forgiven easily, others might follow. If a border people raided and escaped, the heartland was unsafe. So Assyria pushed outward, turning insecurity into expansion. This is one of the great patterns of empire. A state expands to become secure, but every expansion creates a new border. That new border creates new insecurity. To protect the new border, the state expands again. Over time, security becomes endless conquest. Assyria lived inside that logic. The more it conquered, the more lands it had to control. The more lands it controlled, the more rebellions it faced. The more rebellions it faced, the more terror it used. The more terror it used, the more enemies hated it. The more enemies hated it, the more force Assyria needed to survive. You will see later how this becomes one of the reasons Assyria eventually falls. Fear can build an empire, but fear also stores hatred. For a while, terrified enemies obey, but when the center weakens, all that stored hatred returns. For now, however, Assyria is still learning how to become the empire of fear. Its kings developed the image of themselves as hunters of chaos. The royal lion hunt is one of the clearest examples. Lions were not random animals in Assyrian art. They represented wild danger. The king who killed lions showed that he could master forces beyond civilization. Later reliefs of Ashurbanipal's lion hunts are among the most powerful artworks ever created in the ancient world. Wounded lions roar, bleed, struggle, leap, collapse. The king remains controlled. The message is not only that he is brave, the message is that nature itself submits to him. If he can defeat the lion, he can defeat rebels, mountains, foreign kings, and chaos. Imagine a royal lion hunt outside the city. The court gathers. Soldiers and attendants prepare the enclosure or hunting ground. The king stands in his chariot or on foot, bow ready. A lion charges full of fury, its body a storm of muscle and death. For a moment the animal looks like the stronger force, then the king releases the arrow. The lion falls, still fighting life. The crowd watches the king's mastery. The scene will later be carved into stone, repeated forever. It is not sport, it is political theology. The king defeats chaos before the eyes of men and gods. This same idea shaped warfare. A rebellious city was like a lion. A mountain tribe was like a lion. A foreign coalition was like a lion. It had to be hunted, pierced, displayed, and remembered. The Assyrian king did not want to be seen as one ruler among many. He wanted to be seen as the one man chosen to make the world obey. The army became the instrument of that mission. Assyria's military tradition grew over centuries, but by the new Assyrian period it became one of the most advanced military systems the ancient world had seen. It included infantry, cavalry, chariots, engineers, siege specialists, archers, spearmen, shield bearers, scouts, and logistical support. The Assyrians became masters of siege warfare. They built ramps, used battering rams, undermined walls, surrounded cities, cut off supplies, and attacked with terrifying coordination. They did not merely fight armies in open fields. They learned how to break cities, and cities were the heart of ancient resistance. A king could lose a battle and still survive behind walls. A population could wait out invaders if food stores were full. A rebellious city could force an army into a long, expensive siege. Assyria solved this problem by becoming brutally efficient at siegecraft. When Assyrian armies arrived, walls no longer guaranteed safety. That changed the psychology of the ancient Near East. The question was no longer, can our city resist? The question became, what will happen to us if we try? The answer often was meant to frighten. Assyrian reliefs show siege towers and battering rams pressed against walls, archers firing upward, defenders falling, captives led away, goods carried off, officials recording tribute. These images were placed inside palaces where foreign envoys might see them. Imagine being a small king entering an Assyrian palace to bring tribute. On the walls around you, scenes show what happened to those who refused. You do not need a speech, the stones speak clearly. Submit and you may keep your throne. Rebel and your city becomes an example. But Assyria did not only destroy rebellious populations, it moved them. Deportation became one of its most important tools. Instead of simply killing everyone, Assyrian kings often relocated large groups from conquered lands to other parts of the empire. This served multiple purposes. It punished rebellion. It broke local identities and power structures. It supplied labor to underpopulated or strategic areas. It moved skilled workers where the empire needed them. It made provinces easier to control by mixing populations. Deportation was cruel, but it was also administrative. Again, Assyria combined terror with statecraft. Imagine a conquered family after their city falls. They are not killed, but they are ordered to leave. Their home is gone. Their local temple may be destroyed or stripped. Their fields are lost. They walk in a line with others, carrying what little they can. Soldiers guard them. Children cry. Older people stumble. They do not know the language of the place they are being sent. They do not know whether they will ever see their homeland again. To the Assyrian official, they are counted labor, moved population, solved rebellion. To themselves, they are a world uprooted. This policy helped Assyria control territory, but it also spread cultures, skills, and languages across the empire. The empire became a machine of movement. People from one region found themselves living in another. Craftsmen, farmers, soldiers, administrators, and captives moved under state command. This changed the Near East deeply. It weakened some local kingdoms, but also created new mixtures. Assyria's violence reshaped populations in ways that lasted long after its kings died. At the center of all of it was the king, and behind the king was Ashur. The king's relationship with Ashur was not optional. It had to be constantly renewed through temples, rituals, festivals, offerings, and victories. A defeated or inactive king could appear to fail the god. An expanding king could claim divine favor. This pressure drove rulers to campaign almost every year. Assyrian royal inscriptions often present campaigns as regular duties. The king does not simply wait for enemies. He goes out to impose order. The royal year becomes a cycle of war, tribute building, ritual, and inscription. This cycle required discipline. Armies had to be supplied across long distances. Horses, food, weapons, siege equipment, and troops had to move. Messages had to travel quickly. Roads and staging points mattered. Assyria developed systems of communication and provincial control that foreshadowed later imperial methods. The royal road network, relay messengers, and administrative reporting helped the king know what happened across large territories. Assyria became an empire not only because it could win battles, but because it could keep information moving. Information is power. The Assyrians knew this. A rebel governor could not be allowed to act unnoticed. A distant province had to send reports. Tribute had to be recorded. Omens had to be interpreted. Enemy movements had to be known. The king sat at the center of an information web, receiving letters, intelligence, complaints, warnings, and ritual reports. The palace was not only a residence, it was a command center, and yet the king himself was never fully safe. Assyrian kings were surrounded by glory but also danger. Royal succession could be violent, princes competed, court officials plotted, omens could create anxiety. A bad eclipse, a strange birth, a failed ritual, a military setback, all could become politically dangerous. Assyrian kings lived as masters of others but servants of signs. They controlled armies, but they also feared the gods' messages. Diviners, astrologers, priests, and scholars had real importance at court because the king needed to know what heaven was saying. This is another side of Assyria that many people miss. The empire of fear was also an empire of omens. The kings who flayed rebels also listened to scholars interpret the movements of stars. The armies that smashed walls marched under a sky watched carefully for divine signals. The palace contained both weapons and tablets of ancient knowledge. Assyria was brutal, but not intellectually simple. It preserved and studied Mesopotamian learning with intensity. Later in Nineveh, this will reach its greatest form in Ashurbanipal's library. But the roots are already here. The king must know the will of the gods, and knowledge is part of rule. So we should picture Assyria not as a barbaric horde, but as a disciplined, sacred state that made violence into administration. That is far more powerful and far more frightening. A horde may burn out. A disciplined state can repeat terror for generations. As the centuries moved toward the height of Assyrian power, the empire's identity hardened. Ashur demanded expansion. The king embodied order. The army enforced submission. The scribes recorded victory. The artists carved fear into palace walls. The administrators moved people and tribute. The priests watched the gods. The roads carried commands. The enemies learned to tremble. But the machine was not yet at its full peak. The truly imperial Assyria, the Assyria that would dominate the Near East on a scale never before seen, would emerge with a series of powerful kings in the first millennium BC. The most important turning point would come with Tiglath-Pileser III, a ruler who did more than campaign. He reorganized empire itself. He transformed Assyria from a kingdom that conquered and received tribute into a more direct imperial state that absorbed lands, appointed governors, deported populations systematically, and created a structure of control that would carry Assyria to terrifying heights. We will come to him soon. For now, remember the deeper foundation. Assyria was not born terrifying in one moment. It became terrifying because its city was sacred, its god was imperial, its geography was exposed, its memory included humiliation, its kings believed order required conquest, and its state learned to combine violence with record-keeping. The Assyrians did not only fight, they counted, they wrote, they moved people, they interpreted omens, they built roads, they carved messages. They turned fear into a language every neighboring king could understand. As night falls again over the city of Ashur, imagine the temple lamps glowing before the god. Outside, the Tigris moves under the stars. A king stands before the divine image asking for strength. A scribe waits with clay. A commander waits with campaign reports. A priest watches the smoke of an offering. Somewhere beyond the walls, a rebellious city believes it can refuse tribute. Somewhere in the mountains, a local ruler thinks Assyria is too far away to reach him. Somewhere in Babylon, old prestige resists northern domination. Somewhere in the west, rich cities hope distance will protect them. They do not yet understand what Assyria is becoming. They do not yet know that one day the king of Ashur will not merely raid their lands and leave. He will return, he will count, he will punish, he will deport, he will build provinces over their broken independence. And on palace walls, his artists will carve the lesson in stone, so every envoy who enters will understand the same message. Ashur sees, the king obeys, and the world must submit. Assyria's terror did not come only from cruelty. Cruelty alone can frighten people for a season, but it cannot build an empire across mountains, rivers, deserts, cities, and kingdoms. Many ancient armies were cruel, many kings punished enemies. Many cities were burned long before Assyria became great. What made Assyria different was that it turned violence into a system. It studied war, it organized war, it repeated war, it recorded war. It built roads for war, archives for war, provinces after war, deportations after war, and palace walls that taught the memory of war to anyone who entered the king's presence. Assyria became terrifying because its violence was not random, it was disciplined. And discipline is what made the Assyrian army one of the most dangerous machines the ancient world had ever seen. By the time Assyria reached its imperial height, war was no longer only a seasonal adventure led by a proud king and his nobles. It had become an institution. The army had infantry, archers, spearmen, shield-bearers, cavalry, chariots, engineers, siege specialists, scouts, supply officers, scribes, and commanders who could operate across long distances. Earlier Bronze Age warfare had often centered on chariot elites and palace forces. Assyria inherited older traditions but transformed them for the Iron Age. It learned to use iron weapons, large organized armies, cavalry forces, and siege technology in a way that made old defenses feel suddenly fragile. A city wall had once been a promise. It told the people inside, if danger comes, we can survive. It told enemies, you may raid the fields, but you cannot easily take the heart. Walls had protected cities for thousands of years. They forced attackers to stop, camp, starve, negotiate, build ramps, dig tunnels, or leave. A strong wall gave time for allies to arrive. It gave courage to defenders. It made kings think carefully before attacking. Assyria changed the meaning of walls. When Assyrian armies arrived, a wall was no longer a guarantee. It was only a problem waiting to be solved. Imagine a small kingdom in Syria receiving news that the Assyrian king is marching west. At first, the local ruler gathers his council. Some advisors say they should submit and pay tribute. Others say they should trust their walls. They have food stored. The city has resisted enemies before. The gates are strong. The towers are high. The people are afraid but also proud. The ruler hesitates. If he submits, he loses dignity and wealth. If he resists and wins, he becomes a hero. If he resists and loses, he becomes an example. And Assyria was very good at making examples. The army appears first as dust on the horizon, then as lines of soldiers. Then as banners, shields, horses, carts, engineers, and siege equipment. The defenders watch from the walls. The Assyrians do not rush blindly. They measure, they surround, they cut off exits, they build camps, they protect their own lines. Scribes and officials record. Engineers study the wall's weakest points. Archers move into position. Shield bearers protect workers. The siege begins not with chaos but with method. This is the part people often miss. The Assyrians were patient. Their terror was not only in the final punishment. It was in the slow, organized approach that showed defenders the city was being taken apart by a state that had done this before. The Assyrians used siege ramps, piling earth and stone against walls so battering rams and soldiers could reach higher levels. They used battering rams protected by wooden frames, sometimes covered with wet hides to resist fire. They used archers to clear defenders from the walls while engineers worked below. They used sappers to undermine foundations, digging beneath walls to collapse them. They used ladders, towers, and coordinated attacks. They turned the science of breaking cities into imperial art. Picture the defenders after several days. They had expected a battle. Instead, they are watching a machine. The ramp grows closer. The battering ram moves under protection. Arrows fly whenever someone appears above the wall. Fires thrown from the city are put out. Night brings no peace because Assyrian workers continue under guard. Inside, water and food are checked again and again. Families sleep badly. Priests pray. The ruler's advisors stop speaking confidently. The people begin to understand that the wall is not saving them, it is only delaying the decision, and the Assyrians wanted that fear to spread. A siege was not only a military operation, it was theater. The defenders had to see what was coming. Neighboring cities had to hear what happened. Future rebels had to imagine themselves in the same position. Assyria understood that one city's suffering could control 10 cities that had not yet been touched. When the wall finally broke, the punishment depended on the situation. Some cities were looted, some rulers were killed or humiliated, some populations were deported, some rebels were tortured or displayed, some cities were turned into provinces, others were forced back into vassal obedience. Assyrian inscriptions often described these acts with cold pride because the audience was meant to learn. This is hard to read today, and it should be hard. We should not turn Assyrian brutality into entertainment, but we also should not hide it because terror was part of how the empire worked. A conquered ruler might be chained and brought before the Assyrian king. He may have once sat on his own throne, received tribute, held feasts, and spoken as lord of his city. Now he stands barefoot or bound, stripped of royal dignity. Assyrian officials count the tribute taken from his palace. His family may be carried away. His nobles may be executed or deported. His gods may be seized. His city may be reorganized under Assyrian control. The message is clear. Local kings exist only as long as Assyria allows them to exist. But the army did not only destroy, it also absorbed. Assyria needed soldiers constantly, and conquered peoples could be drafted into imperial service. Deportees could become workers, farmers, builders, craftsmen, and soldiers in other parts of the empire. Skilled people were valuable. Assyria did not waste every resource in blind rage. It punished, but it also redistributed. A defeated city might lose its independence, but its population could be moved to build another city, farm another province, strengthen another frontier, or serve another part of the imperial system. In this way, conquest fed the empire. This is why Assyrian deportation was so powerful and so devastating. It did not merely remove people from their homes. It broke the political roots of rebellion. A local population tied to a local king, local gods, local land, and local memory could rebel again and again. But if that population was split, moved, mixed with other groups, and placed under Assyrian administration far away, its ability to resist was weakened. At the same time, loyal or controlled populations could be settled in conquered areas to make them productive and easier to govern. To the Assyrian official, this was efficient. To the deported family, it was the end of a world. Imagine a mother walking in a line of captives after her city falls. She carries a child too tired to cry. Her husband may be dead or walking somewhere behind or separated. Her household gods are gone. The fields where her family had worked for generations are now behind her forever. Soldiers count the line. Officials record numbers. The empire sees bodies, labor, settlement policy. She sees exile. This policy would reshape the ancient Near East. It scattered peoples, mixed cultures, weakened kingdoms, and made Assyria both hated and powerful. Later, when the kingdom of Israel fell to Assyria, deportation became one of the reasons the northern tribes disappeared as a political entity. We will come to that later because the Western campaigns will show the full force of Assyria's imperial machine. For now, understand the principle. Assyria did not only defeat armies, it uprooted societies. The Assyrian army was built for movement. Campaigns could travel across mountains, deserts, rivers, and long roads. The empire developed logistical systems to support this. Food, water, animals, weapons, siege equipment, and communication all had to be managed. A large army can die without battle if it cannot eat. Horses weaken without fodder. Siege engines cannot move without labor and planning. Soldiers cannot fight well if supply lines fail. Assyria's genius was that it turned logistics into a weapon. A king could boast of crossing impossible mountains, cutting through forests, bridging rivers, and reaching lands that believed themselves safe. These boasts were not just vanity. They told enemies that geography would not protect them. Mountains, Assyria would climb. Rivers, Assyria would cross. Deserts, Assyria would prepare. Walls, Assyria would break. Distance, Assyria had roads and messengers. The empire wanted every enemy to feel that nowhere was truly beyond reach. Cavalry became increasingly important in Assyrian warfare. Earlier Near Eastern warfare had relied heavily on chariots for elite mobility, but cavalry offered flexibility, especially in rough terrain where chariots were less useful. Assyrian cavalry could scout, raid, pursue, and fight in ways that widened the army's reach. Chariots still had prestige and battlefield roles, but the Iron Age was changing warfare. Horses were no longer only pulling elite vehicles. Mounted warriors became a growing force. Imagine an Assyrian cavalry patrol moving through hill country before the main army arrives. They scout roads, locate water sources, capture locals for information, watch enemy movement, and send reports back. Behind them comes the larger force, not blindly but informed. War becomes intelligence. The Assyrians do not simply rely on courage, they rely on knowledge. The army was also tied to royal image. The king had to be seen as commander, warrior, hunter, and chosen servant of Ashur. Even if generals and officers handled much of the practical command, the king's presence mattered ideologically. He was the center of victory. His inscriptions described campaigns as his achievements. His reliefs showed him larger, calmer, more controlled than others. The army belonged to the king, and the king belonged to Ashur. Assyrian palace reliefs are among the greatest visual records of ancient warfare. They show soldiers crossing rivers on inflated skins, siege engines attacking walls, archers firing under shields, captives led away, tribute bearers approaching, cities burning, mountains crossed, kings hunting lions. These reliefs decorated royal palaces, especially in places like Nimrud, Khorsabad, and Nineveh. They were not placed randomly. They formed an environment of power. A visitor walking through the palace was surrounded by the king's victories. Every wall said, "This is what Assyria does. This is what the king has done. This is what will happen again." Imagine being a foreign envoy entering such a palace. You have come to bring tribute, negotiate loyalty, or beg mercy. You pass through halls where stone panels show cities under siege, enemies impaled or defeated, captives carrying goods, soldiers marching in perfect order, lions dying under the king's arrows. You do not need to be threatened verbally. The palace itself threatens you. It tells you that Assyria remembers everything, carves everything, and expects obedience. And yet these same reliefs are beautiful. That is the uncomfortable part. The carving is skilled. The detail is extraordinary. Horses strain with life, muscles move under skin. Soldiers are carefully arranged. Trees, rivers, mountains, fortresses, and animals are rendered with attention. The wounded lions of Ashurbanipal's later reliefs are heartbreaking in their realism. Assyrian art can be magnificent and cruel at the same time. It shows us that beauty and violence can live inside the same imperial culture. This should disturb us because it is true far beyond Assyria. The empire also used roads and communication. Royal messengers could move information across large distances. Provinces reported to the center. Governors administered conquered lands. The king needed to know who paid tribute, who delayed, who rebelled, who plotted, who needed troops, and where resources were located. Without communication, empire becomes rumor. With communication, empire becomes command. Assyria's provincial system evolved over time. Some conquered regions were left under vassal kings, especially if they submitted and paid tribute, but repeated rebellion could lead to annexation. A kingdom could lose its local dynasty and become an Assyrian province governed by officials appointed by the king. This was a major step in imperial control. Tribute became taxation. Local independence became administration. Assyria learned that vassals were useful but unreliable. Provinces were harder to create but easier to control once established. This is where Tiglath-Pileser III becomes crucial later. He will take these tools and sharpen them into a new imperial structure. He will reduce the independence of vassal states, expand provincial administration, and use deportation more systematically. But the foundations already exist in Assyria's military and ideological culture. The world must submit, and submission must be organized. The psychological side of Assyrian warfare is perhaps the most famous, but it was not simply sadism. Terror had calculation. If one rebellious city was punished horribly, another might surrender without resistance, saving Assyrian lives and resources. Fear reduced the cost of control, but fear also had a long-term cost. People who obey because they are terrified do not become loyal in their hearts. They wait, they remember, they teach their children, they look for moments of weakness. This is the seed of Assyria's future fall. For generations, fear will work. It will bring tribute. It will break coalitions. It will make kings bow. It will move populations. It will build palaces. It will fill libraries. It will stretch Assyrian power farther than ever before. But fear stores hatred like dry wood. And when the Assyrian center weakens, that wood will catch fire. You will see that at the end of the story, when Babylon, Medes, and others turn against the empire and Nineveh itself falls. The same terror that made Assyria powerful will make its enemies merciless when the time comes, but that is later. For now, the Assyrian war machine is still rising. Let us return to a campaign scene. The king has ordered a western city to pay tribute. The city delays. Perhaps it hopes Egypt will help. Perhaps it trusts its walls. Perhaps its ruler thinks Assyria is busy elsewhere. The Assyrian king receives the report. To ignore the delay would be dangerous. One refusal invites another, so the army marches. First come scouts and messengers, then the main force, infantry in ranks, archers with bows, shield bearers carrying large protective shields, engineers with tools, carts carrying supplies, horses and mules, officers, scribes, priests or diviners perhaps accompanying the royal mission. The army is not a mob. It is the state in motion. The city sees the dust, gates close. Families crowd behind walls. The ruler sends a message offering partial tribute. Too late. Assyria wants submission, not bargaining from weakness. The siege begins. A ramp rises. Arrows darken the air. The battering ram strikes. Days pass. The wall breaks. Soldiers enter. The city screams. Afterward, scribes count. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, cattle, sheep, horses, furniture, royal goods, people. Everything becomes record. The defeated ruler is displayed or removed. Some people are deported. Assyrian officials reorganize the city. A relief may later show the scene in the king's palace. The message travels faster than the refugees. Another nearby city hears and sends tribute immediately. This is how terror becomes administration. But the Assyrian army also inspired loyalty among its own people and beneficiaries. Soldiers could gain wealth. Officials could gain status. The empire brought goods into Assyria. Cities like Nimrud and Nineveh grew magnificent through conquest. Palaces were built with materials and labor from across the empire. Foreign craftsmen contributed to Assyrian grandeur. Exotic animals, plants, and goods arrived. The king could present the empire not only as fear but as abundance. To Assyrian elites, conquest meant glory, wealth, divine favor, and order. They did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as the center of civilization. This is another uncomfortable truth. Empires are often loved at the center and hated at the edges. The same campaign that devastates one city fills another palace with tribute. The same deportation that destroys one family supplies labor for another royal project. The same king who is cursed by enemies is praised by his own scribes. History must hold both perspectives, or it becomes propaganda. Assyria's military success also depended on adaptation. It learned from enemies, it used foreign troops, it incorporated technologies, it moved skilled populations, it reorganized conquered lands. It was not rigid, it was aggressive and flexible. That combination made it terrifying. A rigid empire can be outmaneuvered. A flexible empire learns from resistance. Yet the machine required strong kings. When the king was capable, Assyria expanded. When kings were weak or succession became unstable, rebellions multiplied, provinces tested limits, vassals withheld tribute, enemies formed coalitions. This pattern will appear repeatedly. Assyria's strength was enormous, but it had to be constantly renewed through campaign and punishment. Peace, strangely, could be dangerous if it looked like inactivity. A king who did not campaign might seem weak. A weak king invited rebellion, so the machine kept moving. War became normal. That may be the most frightening thing of all. A state can reach a point where constant war is not an emergency but a routine. Campaign season comes, the king marches, tribute is collected, rebels are punished, inscriptions are written. The next year, another campaign. This normalizing of violence is what made Assyria so effective and so feared. The empire did not treat war as a breakdown of order. It treated war as the method of order. For the people under Assyrian rule, life varied. Some regions may have benefited from imperial roads, trade, and stability if they submitted. Not every province was burning all the time. Farmers farmed, merchants traded, local elites adapted, some deported communities built new lives. The empire was not constant chaos. In fact, Assyria wanted controlled productivity. Dead lands do not pay taxes, empty fields do not feed armies. The point of terror was to create obedience, and obedience was meant to produce revenue. So the empire could bring a form of peace, but it was the peace of fear. A road may be safer because Assyria controls it. Trade may move because bandits are suppressed. A city may prosper if loyal, but everyone knows what happens if loyalty breaks. Stability exists under the shadow of punishment. That kind of order can last, sometimes for a long time, but it is brittle. It depends on the center remaining terrifying. As this part of the story settles, picture an Assyrian army camp at night. Fires burn in rows, horses shift in the darkness. Soldiers repair gear, engineers sharpen tools, scribes sit near lamps recording supplies and orders. Captured locals are questioned, officers discuss tomorrow's march. Somewhere in the royal tent, omens may be considered, reports read, decisions made. Beyond the camp, a city waits behind walls, hoping dawn will bring mercy or rescue. Above all of them, in Assyrian belief, Ashur watches. The soldiers sleep because they have marched far and will march farther. The city does not sleep because it knows who has arrived. And in the darkness between them, the future of the ancient Near East is being shaped by a machine of iron, fear, discipline, and memory, a machine that is not yet at its peak, but soon will be, because the next great transformation is coming. A king will rise who does not merely raid distant lands, he will reorganize empire itself. He will make Assyria more direct, more permanent, more efficient, and more terrifying. His name will be Tiglath-Pileser III. And after him, the ancient world will understand that Assyria has changed from a powerful kingdom into something far more dangerous, an empire designed to stay. Tiglath-Pileser III did not inherit a peaceful kingdom waiting politely to become an empire. He came to power in a time when Assyria was strong in memory, dangerous in potential, but strained by weakness, rebellion, and disorder. The machine existed, but it needed a new master. Assyria had already shown the world what it could do. Its kings had marched across mountains, broken cities, received tribute, and carved fear into their inscriptions. But power that is not organized begins to leak away. Vassals test the borders. Governors grow too independent. Enemies measure the distance between royal command and royal action. Tribute slows. Local kings smile while preparing betrayal. The empire still has teeth, but the bite is not felt everywhere at once. That is when Tiglath-Pileser III appears, and with him Assyria changes, not just expands, changes. He is one of the most important rulers in the entire story of ancient empire, because he understood something that earlier kings had approached but not perfected. Conquering a land once was not enough. Taking tribute was not enough. Frightening a king and leaving him on his throne was not enough. If a vassal ruler could rebel again the next year, then the empire had only rented obedience. Tiglath-Pileser wanted more than tribute. He wanted structure. He wanted direct control. He wanted Assyria to stop acting like a kingdom that repeatedly punished rebellious neighbors and start acting like an imperial state that absorbed them. This is why his reign becomes a turning point. Before him, Assyria was terrifying. After him, Assyria became systematic. The circumstances of his rise are shadowy and possibly violent. He may have taken the throne during a revolt or palace coup. His original name may have been Pulu, and he adopted the royal name Tiglath-Pileser, connecting himself to earlier Assyrian greatness. This already tells us something. A new ruler in Assyria did not simply need power, he needed legitimacy. A king had to present himself as chosen, rightful, continuous with the sacred mission of Ashur. If his path to the throne was messy, he had to cover the mess with victory, and Tiglath-Pileser did exactly that. He made conquest his proof. Imagine Assyria before his reforms. The heartland still reveres Ashur, the army still exists, the royal inscriptions still remember past glory, but the outer regions are unstable. Powerful officials may control too much. Neighboring kingdoms believe Assyria can be resisted. Urartu, the strong kingdom in the north, threatens Assyrian interests. Aramean and Syrian states in the west shift alliances. Babylon in the south remains both culturally prestigious and politically troublesome. The empire needs a king who can restore fear but also make fear durable. Tiglath-Pileser III begins by tightening the state. He reduces the power of overmighty governors and magnates. He reorganizes provinces into smaller, more manageable units. This matters deeply. A vast province governed by a powerful local official can become almost a kingdom inside the empire. Such officials may grow rich, build local loyalty, and eventually threaten the crown. By dividing territories and strengthening direct royal control, Tiglath-Pileser makes the empire answer more clearly to the center. He does not only fight enemies outside, he disciplines power inside. That is what strong empire builders often do first. They make sure the machine obeys them before they send it outward. Then he transforms conquest itself. Instead of allowing defeated rulers to remain as vassals again and again after rebellion, he increasingly annexes territories directly. A rebellious kingdom might be turned into an Assyrian province, its ruler removed, its elites deported or replaced, its tribute converted into regular taxation, its people counted, its land governed by Assyrian officials. This is a much deeper form of control. A vassal king can change sides. A province is harder to detach, at least while the imperial center remains strong. This approach changes the psychology of every neighboring ruler. Before, a king might think, if I rebel and lose, I may pay heavy tribute, but perhaps I will keep my throne. After Tiglath-Pileser, the thought becomes darker. If I rebel and lose, my kingdom may cease to exist. That is a different level of fear, and Assyria wanted that fear. Tiglath-Pileser also made deportation a central imperial tool. Earlier Assyrian kings had deported populations, but under his system it became more organized and more transformative. Conquered peoples could be moved from their homeland to other parts of the empire, while other populations were settled in their place. This broke local resistance, supplied labor, and tied distant regions into the imperial economy. It was cruel but efficient. Assyria was not only punishing cities, it was redesigning the human map. Picture a conquered Syrian city after Tiglath-Pileser's army has taken it. The local king is gone. The palace has been stripped. Assyrian officials arrive with tablets, seals, soldiers, and orders. They do not merely collect treasure and leave. They measure land. They count people. They identify craftsmen, soldiers, nobles, farmers, and families. Some are selected for deportation. Others remain under new administration. New officials take command. Tribute becomes tax. The city's old political story ends not in ashes alone, but in paperwork. This is the frightening genius of Tiglath-Pileser. He turns conquest into administration. The soldier breaks the gate. The scribe makes the conquest permanent, and behind both stands the king, servant of Ashur. His military campaigns are wide and relentless. He fights in the north against Urartu and its allies. Urartu was no minor nuisance. It was a powerful kingdom centered around the Armenian highlands, with strong fortresses, difficult terrain, and ambitions of its own. For Assyria, Urartu was dangerous because it could challenge control of the north and influence regions that Assyria wanted secure. Mountains always troubled Assyria. They sheltered enemies, slowed armies, and created rival powers difficult to crush completely. Tiglath-Pileser campaigns against them with force, pushing back their influence and reminding the highlands that Assyria is awake again. Imagine the Assyrian army moving through northern terrain. This is not the flat, open land of southern Mesopotamia. The roads are hard, the air is colder, fortresses stand on heights, local enemies know the land, supply is difficult, chariots are less useful in rough places, infantry and cavalry matter more, engineers must deal with steep approaches. But Assyria does not turn back easily. The king's inscriptions will later speak of mountains crossed, enemies defeated, tribute taken. Every mountain campaign carries a message. Do not believe distance or terrain will save you. Then Tiglath-Pileser turns west. The western lands are wealthy, divided, and politically nervous. Syria and the Levant contain many kingdoms and city-states: Damascus, Hamath, Arpad, Israel, Judah, Tyre, and others. Some are rich from trade, some are strategically placed, some seek help from Egypt, some form coalitions, some pay tribute to Assyria when frightened, then rebel when they see a chance. To Assyria, the West is both treasure and trouble. It provides wealth, access to Mediterranean trade, and a route toward Egypt. But it is full of small states that hate submission. Arpad becomes one of the key early Western targets. It resists Assyria and pays dearly. Tiglath-Pileser besieges it for years before finally taking it. That long siege shows both the difficulty of Western resistance and Assyria's persistence. Many kings could win a battle. Fewer could maintain a years-long pressure until a city broke. When Arpad falls, the message spreads across Syria. Assyria does not forget. Assyria does not tire quickly. Assyria does not accept symbolic obedience forever. A nearby ruler hearing of Arpad's fall must reconsider everything. His walls may be strong. His allies may promise help. Egypt may send encouraging messages, but Arpad resisted and Arpad fell. How long can his own city endure? What will happen to his family? Will his people be deported? Will his gods be carried off? Will his kingdom become a province? Tiglath-Pileser wants these questions to do half the work before his army arrives. The kingdom of Israel also enters the story during this period. The northern kingdom, already troubled by internal instability, becomes caught in the machinery of Assyrian expansion. Tiglath-Pileser intervenes in the politics of the Levant, receives tribute, takes territory, and eventually annexes parts of Israel's land. Deportations follow. The northern kingdom is weakened severely, and later, under Assyria's successors, Samaria will fall completely. But Tiglath-Pileser begins the process by showing that the kingdoms of the West are no longer safe behind distance, alliances, or local politics. Judah, farther south, faces the same terrifying reality. Its rulers must decide whether to resist, submit, or maneuver between Assyria and regional enemies. In the ancient Near East, small kingdoms rarely had good choices when a superpower approached. Submission meant humiliation and heavy tribute. Resistance meant possible destruction. Appealing to another great power like Egypt could provoke Assyria further if help did not arrive in time. Local kings had to survive inside the shadow of giants. Imagine a royal council in Jerusalem or Samaria when news arrives that Tiglath-Pileser's forces are moving again. One advisor says, "Pay tribute, live." Another says, "If we submit, we become slaves." Another says, "Egypt will help." Another quietly asks, "Will Egypt arrive before Assyria?" The king listens, knowing every option is dangerous. Outside, ordinary people do not debate strategy. They worry about fields, taxes, sons taken for war, and the rumor that Assyria moves entire populations. That rumor was not empty, it was policy. Tiglath-Pileser's empire also moved south into Babylonian affairs. Babylon was always more than a city to Assyria. It was old, sacred, prestigious, and difficult. Assyrian kings wanted to control Babylonia, but they also respected its religious importance. To rule Babylon poorly was dangerous because Babylonian culture had immense symbolic weight. Tiglath-Pileser eventually becomes king of Babylon under the name Pulu, taking the Babylonian throne himself. This is a clever solution. Instead of merely conquering Babylon as a foreign enemy, he enters its kingship tradition. He becomes both Assyrian king and Babylonian king, but Babylon would never be easy. You will see later that Assyria's relationship with Babylon becomes one of the empire's deepest wounds. Again and again, Babylon submits, rebels, is punished, restored, honored, and crushed. It is like a sacred flame Assyria cannot extinguish and cannot safely hold. Tiglath-Pileser manages it with intelligence, but the problem does not disappear. Babylon will return in the story, and when it does, the consequences will be enormous. For now, Tiglath-Pileser's achievement is clear. He has turned Assyria into a true imperial system. He strengthens the army. He reorganizes provinces. He weakens overpowerful officials. He annexes lands directly. He uses deportation systematically. He dominates the West. He challenges Urartu. He controls Babylon. He makes Assyria feared again. But what kind of world does this create? For Assyrian elites, it creates wealth and glory. Tribute flows in: gold, silver, iron, ivory, textiles, horses, cattle, timber, luxury goods, skilled workers, and exotic items from distant lands. The king can build, the army can expand, the temples can be honored. The god Ashur receives the wealth of the world. Assyrian identity grows more confident. The empire feels chosen, unstoppable, disciplined, and sacred. For conquered peoples, it creates dread. Their kings may be removed, their children may be taken. Their cities may be turned into provinces. Their local gods may lose central status. Their land may receive strangers from other regions. Their own families may be sent far away. Assyria is no longer only an army that appears and leaves. Assyria becomes the government over them. There is a special fear in that. An army can be endured if it passes. Administration stays. The Assyrian official arrives after the battle and makes defeat permanent. He counts fields, he demands taxes, he reports to the king, he controls labor, he watches local elites, he sends information back to the center. The conquered land becomes part of a machine. Its old stories do not matter as much as its usefulness to Assyria. But the machine also creates stability. This is the uncomfortable balance. Roads become safer under imperial control. Trade can move if rebellion is suppressed. Provinces may be productive. Deportees may rebuild lives in new places. Cities that submit may prosper under Assyrian protection. Empire is not only destruction every day, it is order enforced by the memory of destruction. That is why it can last. If it were only chaos, it would burn out. Assyria lasts because it makes fear productive. Tiglath-Pileser's reforms influence every major Assyrian king after him. He creates the model that Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal will use and expand. These later rulers will build larger palaces, fight greater wars, push into Egypt, crush Babylon, gather libraries, and create some of the most dramatic scenes in ancient history. But they inherit the imperial structure Tiglath-Pileser sharpened. He is the hinge. Before him, Assyria is powerful but inconsistent. After him, Assyria becomes the empire of provinces, deportations, permanent military pressure, and direct rule. And yet, every strength he creates also contains a future danger. The more provinces Assyria controls, the more borders it must defend. The more peoples it deports, the more resentment it spreads. The more tribute it demands, the more rebellions it invites. The more fear it uses, the more hatred it stores. The more the king becomes central, the more dangerous succession becomes. The more the empire expands, the more it must keep expanding to maintain momentum. Tiglath-Pileser solves Assyria's immediate problems by building a stronger machine. But a stronger machine needs more fuel. Assyria will need constant campaigns, constant tribute, constant obedience, constant intimidation. If the machine slows, everything it has compressed may push back. That is the hidden cost of his genius. But during his lifetime, the machine works. Picture the Assyrian royal court after a successful campaign. Envoys from the west arrive carrying tribute, gold vessels, silver, fine cloth, horses, ivory, timber, bowing rulers, captives, scribes record everything. Officials assign goods to palace, temple, army, and workshops. The king sits above them not merely as a man receiving wealth, but as the earthly servant of Ashur receiving the submission of distant lands. Every tribute bearer confirms the story Assyria tells about itself. The world resists, the king marches, Ashur triumphs, order expands. Now picture the other side. A family from a conquered region begins its forced journey east. They pass through lands they do not know, guarded by soldiers whose language may be strange to them. They carry memory, but not their home. They are part of the same imperial success celebrated in the palace. The tribute scene and the deportation march are two halves of one reality. One is carved as glory, the other is lived as grief. This is the Assyrian Empire. You cannot understand it if you see only the brutality. You cannot understand it if you see only the organization. It is both. Tiglath-Pileser III dies after leaving Assyria far stronger than he found it, but the empire he builds cannot rest. His successors inherit a structure designed for expansion and control. They must keep the West obedient. They must manage Babylon. They must face Urartu. They must control provinces filled with displaced peoples and resentful elites. They must prove themselves to Ashur and to the army. A weak successor would invite rebellion. So the next kings must continue the cycle, and they do. After Tiglath-Pileser, Shalmaneser V continues Assyrian pressure in the west, including the siege of Samaria, though his reign is short and shadowy. Then comes Sargon II, a king with a name deliberately echoing the ancient Sargon of Akkad, one of Mesopotamia's greatest conquerors. Like Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon may have come to the throne under uncertain circumstances, and like Tiglath-Pileser, he used victory to prove legitimacy. He will complete the fall of Samaria, fight Urartu, build a new capital, and push Assyria into even greater imperial grandeur. But that is the next turn. For now, the ancient Near East has learned a new reality. Assyria does not merely raid. Assyria annexes. Assyria does not merely frighten. Assyria reorganizes. Assyria does not merely defeat kings. Assyria removes kingdoms. The age of tribute is becoming the age of empire. As night settles over the Assyrian heartland, imagine Tiglath-Pileser's scribes storing campaign records in the royal archive. The tablets speak of lands subdued, peoples moved, tribute counted, provinces created, enemies defeated. Outside, soldiers return with loot and prisoners. Priests offer thanks to Ashur. Officials prepare the next administrative orders. The king has made Assyria stronger than before, but he has also made it hungrier. Far away in the west, small kingdoms whisper his name with fear. In Babylon, priests watch Assyrian power with unease. In the north, Urartu prepares for future struggle. In the villages of deported peoples, families begin new lives they did not choose. And in the palace, the machine of empire keeps turning. The next kings will not need to invent it, they will only need to feed it. After Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyria was no longer simply a powerful kingdom that punished its neighbors. It had become a machine designed to absorb them. The old world of nervous vassals and temporary tribute had changed into something colder and more permanent. A kingdom that resisted could be erased from the map. Its ruler could be removed, its people could be deported, its cities could become provinces. Its local gods, nobles, fields, roads, soldiers, and taxes could be folded into Assyria's system. Tiglath-Pileser had sharpened the blade, but the blade still needed hands to use it, and the kings who came after him would use it with terrifying ambition. The next great figure was Sargon II, a king whose very name was a message. Sargon was not a simple personal name. It echoed one of the most ancient conquerors in Mesopotamian memory, Sargon of Akkad, the legendary ruler who had built one of the first great empires more than 1,000 years earlier. By taking or carrying that name, Sargon II was not only ruling Assyria, he was placing himself inside the deepest tradition of kingship and conquest. He was saying that he belonged among the world makers, the men whose power changed the shape of lands. But there was a problem. His rise to the throne may not have been smooth. Like several Assyrian rulers, he may have come to power through uncertain or violent circumstances. And when a king's legitimacy is uncertain, victory becomes more than glory. Victory becomes proof that the gods chose him. Sargon II inherited the empire that Tiglath-Pileser had reorganized, but he also inherited its dangers. The west was restless, Babylon was difficult, Urartu in the north remained a serious rival. The provinces had to be watched, deportees had to be settled. Tribute had to keep moving, governors had to stay loyal. Every new king had to prove that the center was still strong, because the moment Assyria looked weak, rebellion could spread like fire in dry grass. This is one of the hard truths of ruling by fear. Fear must be renewed. People do not obey yesterday's terror forever if today's king looks uncertain. So Sargon had to show the world that Assyria had not softened. He had to march, punish, reorganize, and carve his authority into the political memory of the Near East. One of the most famous events connected with this period was the fall of Samaria, capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. The process had already begun under earlier Assyrian pressure. Israel had been weakened by internal instability, tribute demands, territorial losses, and the impossible choice every small kingdom faced when Assyria came close: submit and survive as a shadow, or resist and risk destruction. Hoshea, the last king of Israel, became caught in this trap. He had been an Assyrian vassal, but he appears to have sought support elsewhere, likely from Egypt, and stopped paying tribute. To a small kingdom, this may have seemed like a desperate gamble. If Egypt helped, perhaps Israel could escape Assyrian domination. If Egypt delayed or failed, Israel would stand alone before the most dangerous empire in the world. This was the fatal problem of trusting distant help against Assyria. Egypt could promise, Egypt could encourage. Egypt could whisper resistance into the ears of Western rulers. But when Assyrian armies arrived, Egyptian support was often too slow, too limited, or too cautious. For the people of Samaria, the result was catastrophe. The city was besieged. Think about what a siege meant, not as a line in a history book, but as a lived nightmare. The gates are shut. The fields outside cannot be reached. Food becomes precious. Water is watched. Every sound from outside the wall matters. Children ask why no one can leave. Soldiers on the walls stare at the Assyrian camp day after day and understand that this army has not come for a quick raid. It has come to stay until the city breaks. Inside Samaria, the king and his advisors may still have hoped for rescue. Perhaps Egypt would move. Perhaps another rebellion would distract Assyria. Perhaps the walls would hold. Perhaps the enemy would tire. But Assyria had learned patience. Its sieges were not storms that came and vanished. They were pressure. They were hunger turned into strategy. Outside the city, Assyrian soldiers built, watched, blocked, and waited. Inside, fear changed into exhaustion. When a city is under siege long enough, politics begins to rot from within. People blame the king. The king blames traitors. Priests pray. Mothers hide food. Soldiers grow weak. Rumors become weapons. And every day the enemy remains outside, the idea of survival becomes smaller. When Samaria finally fell, the northern kingdom of Israel as an independent political state was finished. Assyria deported portions of the population and brought other peoples into the land, following the imperial policy that had become so central to its control. This was not only punishment, it was the destruction of political identity. Remove elites, move populations. Break the bond between land, king, temple, tribe, memory, and rebellion. To Assyria, this was administration. To the people taken from their homes, it was exile. Families were pulled into the machinery of empire, sent to places they did not choose, surrounded by languages and landscapes they did not know. Their kingdom did not simply lose a battle, it lost its future as a state. And yet, even here, history is complicated. The people did not vanish as human beings. They lived, adapted, married, worked, prayed, remembered, and changed. But the northern kingdom disappeared from the political map, and over time its deported groups became part of the long memory later described as the lost tribes. Assyria had done what it did so often. It turned a living kingdom into an imperial problem solved by force, counting, and movement. In the royal inscriptions, this could be presented as another triumph of the king. In human reality, it was grief carried along dusty roads. For Sargon II, the fall of Samaria was one piece of a much larger imperial career. He fought in the west, pushed against coalitions, and dealt with cities that looked toward Egypt for support. He campaigned against Urartu, the powerful northern rival that had long challenged Assyria in the mountain zones. Urartu was not easy prey. It was a kingdom of fortresses, highlands, and skilled resistance. Its terrain itself was a defense. Assyrian armies were terrifying on open roads and before city walls, but mountain warfare was always harder. Supplies became difficult, weather could turn, local enemies knew the passes, fortresses could sit on heights like clenched fists, but Sargon understood that Urartu could not be ignored. A rival in the north could encourage rebellion, threaten trade routes, and undermine Assyrian confidence. His campaign against Urartu and the region around it became one of his great claims to glory. Assyrian inscriptions describe difficult marches, enemy defeats, captured cities, seized treasures, and the humiliation of rival power. Again, we must remember that royal inscriptions were not neutral reports. They were shaped to magnify the king. But they reveal what Assyria wanted everyone to believe. No mountain was too difficult, no fortress too high, no rival too remote, no god of another land strong enough to protect enemies from Ashur's king. This was the same message again and again, delivered in different landscapes. Walls will not save you, rivers will not save you, mountains will not save you, distant alliances will not save you. Sargon also faced Babylon, as every major Assyrian king eventually had to. Babylon was not like other conquered cities. It had a sacred prestige that Assyria could never fully ignore. The Assyrians shared much of Mesopotamian culture with Babylonia. They respected Babylon's gods, traditions, scholarship, and ancient status. But Babylon was also politically rebellious and strategically vital. To rule Mesopotamia, Assyria had to control Babylon. To control Babylon, Assyria had to handle it carefully. Too much brutality could shock the religious conscience of the region. Too much leniency could invite rebellion. This tension never disappeared. It would torment Assyrian kings again and again, and later, under Sennacherib, it would explode in a way that even Assyrians found difficult to forget. But that dark moment is still ahead. Sargon II wanted not only to conquer. He wanted to build. Like many ancient kings, he understood that architecture could become a form of kingship. A palace was not just a home. A capital was not just a city. It was a statement in stone and brick. It told subjects and foreigners that the king's power had become permanent. So Sargon built a new capital called Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon at modern Khorsabad. This was an enormous project, planned as a royal city that would display his authority, his divine favor, and his imperial reach. To build a new capital was to remake the world around the king's own name. Imagine Dur-Sharrukin rising from the ground. Workers arrive from many lands. Some are Assyrians, some may be deportees or laborers from conquered regions. Stone is carved, mud brick is formed. Timber is hauled, walls rise, gates take shape. Winged bulls and protective spirits are carved for palace entrances. Reliefs are planned to show campaigns, tribute gods, and royal power. The new city becomes a theater of empire before it is even finished. Every stone says, Sargon is king. Sargon is chosen. Sargon has made order. Sargon's rule deserves its own city. The great protective figures at Assyrian palace gates, often human-headed winged bulls or lions called lamassu, were more than decoration. They guarded thresholds. They combined strength, intelligence, divine protection, and supernatural authority. A visitor approaching the palace would pass beneath their gaze and feel small. Their bodies were massive. Their wings suggested divine reach. Their human faces suggested watchfulness. They were carved power. They said that the king's palace was not ordinary space. It was protected by forces greater than men. Inside such palaces, reliefs covered walls with the story of conquest, tribute bearers from distant lands, cities under siege, the king hunting. Soldiers crossing rivers, enemy rulers humbled, foreign animals and goods arriving as signs of imperial reach. Assyrian kings did not want blank walls. They wanted memory surrounding them. They wanted every corridor to repeat the same truth: the king has conquered and the world has submitted. A palace was an archive in stone, designed not for quiet reading but for overwhelming the senses. But Sargon's great new city carried a strange shadow. He did not enjoy it for long. In 705 BC, Sargon II died in battle, likely in Anatolia, and his body was not recovered. For an Assyrian king, this was more than a military misfortune. It was a religious and symbolic disaster. The king chosen by Ashur, the builder of a new capital, the conqueror, the one who claimed divine favor, died far from home and did not receive proper burial. In the ancient mind, this was terrifying. What did it mean? Had the gods turned away? Had some sin polluted the king? Was Dur-Sharrukin cursed by association? Sargon's son, Sennacherib, seems to have avoided completing or using his father's capital in the same way and instead made Nineveh his great royal center. You will see soon how important that decision becomes, because Nineveh will become the most famous Assyrian city of all, and its fall will later become one of the most dramatic reversals in ancient history. Sennacherib inherited the empire after Sargon's shocking death. He was not stepping into a calm inheritance. A king's death, especially one so ominous, could encourage rebellion. Enemies watched carefully. Vassals wondered whether the new ruler would be strong. Babylon, always difficult, became a problem again. The West stirred. The empire that looked so powerful from the outside always became vulnerable during succession. This is another pattern in Assyrian history. The empire's strength depended heavily on the king's ability to prove himself quickly. Sennacherib had to show that Sargon's death did not mean Ashur had abandoned Assyria. He did this with force. Sennacherib is one of the most famous Assyrian kings, partly because of his campaigns in the West and his conflict with Judah, partly because of his building of Nineveh, and partly because of his brutal handling of Babylon. He was a builder, warrior, administrator, and propagandist. Under him, Assyria's imperial image became even grander, but its contradictions became darker. Early in his reign, rebellion broke out in the West. Hezekiah, king of Judah, was among those who resisted Assyrian domination, likely encouraged by wider anti-Assyrian sentiment and hopes of Egyptian support. This was a dangerous gamble, just as it had been for Israel. Judah was smaller than Assyria by a scale almost impossible to exaggerate. Assyria was an empire of armies, provinces, siege engineers, cavalry, and terrifying reputation. Judah was a hill kingdom with fortified cities, religious confidence, local alliances, and hope that Assyria could be checked. Yet small kingdoms often resist not because they are foolish, but because submission feels like slow suffocation. Tribute drains wealth, vassalage humiliates kings, imperial demands threaten autonomy. At some point, a ruler may decide that danger is better than permanent obedience. Sennacherib marched west in 701 BC. His campaign became one of the most famous in Near Eastern history because it appears both in Assyrian records and in the Hebrew Bible, though each source frames it differently. The Assyrian account emphasizes Sennacherib's devastating success. He captured fortified cities of Judah, trapped Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage, took tribute, and punished rebellion. The biblical account emphasizes Jerusalem's survival and divine deliverance. These two memories stand side by side, not exactly canceling each other, but revealing different truths. Assyria devastated Judah. Jerusalem survived. Sennacherib did not take the city, but Judah paid heavily. The siege and capture of Lachish, one of Judah's major fortified cities, became especially important. Sennacherib had it carved in remarkable detail on palace reliefs at Nineveh. Those reliefs are among the most vivid visual records of an Assyrian siege. They show the city under attack, siege ramps, battering rams, archers, defenders, captives, booty, and the Assyrian king receiving submission. Lachish was not just conquered, it was turned into a lesson in stone. Imagine Lachish as the Assyrian army approaches. The city stands on a mound, fortified, proud, full of people who know Jerusalem is watching and Assyria is coming. Refugees from nearby towns may have crowded inside. Soldiers prepare stones, arrows, and defenses. Families pray. The gate is sealed. Then the Assyrians begin their work. A siege ramp rises toward the wall. Battering rams crawl forward under protection. Archers fire in waves. Defenders throw torches, stones, and whatever they can. Dust fills the air. The sound of the rams striking the wall repeats like doom. Day after day, the machine comes closer. When the city falls, people are led away. Some are killed, some deported. Assyrian officials count the spoils. Later, the scene is carved for the palace at Nineveh, so every visitor can see what happens when Judah's fortified cities resist. Jerusalem, however, did not fall. Why? The reasons remain debated. Disease, tribute payment, logistical concerns, Egyptian or Cushite pressure, divine intervention according to biblical memory, or strategic choice may all be discussed. What is clear is that Sennacherib did not capture Jerusalem, but he did reduce Judah severely and forced Hezekiah to submit tribute. For Assyria, the campaign could still be presented as success. For Judah, survival became sacred memory. The same event became imperial victory in one tradition and divine rescue in another. This is how history splits depending on who survives to tell it. While the West occupied part of Sennacherib's reign, Babylon became his deepest frustration. Babylon rebelled repeatedly, supported at times by Chaldean leaders and Elamite involvement. To Assyria, Babylon was a problem that would not stay solved. To Babylon, Assyria was a northern power that could dominate but never fully own its soul. Sennacherib's patience eventually broke. In 689 BC, after years of rebellion and conflict, he destroyed Babylon. This was one of the most shocking acts in Mesopotamian history. He claimed to have devastated the city, flooded it, removed its gods, and turned it into a ruin. Whether every detail is literal or royal exaggeration, the event was traumatic. Babylon was not just another enemy city, it was sacred. To destroy Babylon was to wound Mesopotamian tradition itself. Even Assyria could not live comfortably with that act forever. Later kings would reverse or repair the damage. Sennacherib's own son Esarhaddon would rebuild Babylon, presenting restoration as necessary and divinely approved. This shows that Sennacherib's destruction, though politically understandable from Assyria's anger, created a religious and ideological problem. Assyria could terrorize many cities, but Babylon's sacred prestige made its destruction dangerous to the empire's own legitimacy. It is one thing to crush a rebellious hill city. It is another to destroy the ancient home of Marduk. This is one of the deep contradictions of Assyria. It wanted total control, but some places could not be reduced to ordinary provinces without spiritual cost. Babylon was the great example. Assyria could defeat Babylon militarily, but Babylonian prestige kept returning like a ghost. The city would eventually help bring Assyria down. Remember that, because the empire's future enemies were not only outside its history, some were created by its own violence. Sennacherib also transformed Nineveh. He made it a magnificent capital, expanding it with walls, palaces, canals, gardens, and monumental art. Nineveh became the face of Assyrian greatness. If Dur-Sharrukin had been Sargon's dream, Nineveh became Sennacherib's statement. He brought water through engineering works, improved the city, and built the southwest palace, calling it a palace without rival. The empire's wealth poured into it. Materials, craftsmen, labor, tribute, and artistic skill from across the empire gathered there. Nineveh became beautiful because other lands had submitted. Like many imperial capitals, its splendor was built from distant fear. Imagine entering Nineveh at its height. The city is enormous, protected by walls, alive with movement. Canals bring water, gardens grow, palaces rise with carved reliefs, officials hurry through courts, foreign envoys bring tribute, soldiers train, scribes record, craftsmen carve, priests serve gods. The king's palace is filled with scenes of victory. It is not merely a royal residence. It is the world according to Assyria, arranged in stone. Everything leads to the king, everything proves his power, but inside the royal house danger remained. Sennacherib was eventually assassinated by his own sons, a violent end that echoed the old truth of Near Eastern monarchy. A king could terrify the world and still be killed inside his family. The throne passed to Esarhaddon after a succession struggle. Again, Assyria survived because a strong successor emerged. But every royal murder was a crack in the image of perfect order. The empire could crush cities, but it could not remove ambition from princes. Esarhaddon would take Assyria even farther, including into Egypt itself, but he would also try to heal the wound his father made in Babylon. That balance, conquest and restoration, terror and piety, violence and repair, would define the next stage of the story. Assyria was now at a height few ancient states had ever reached. It ruled lands from Mesopotamia to the Levant. It could threaten Egypt. It had turned cities into provinces and kings into servants. Nineveh was rising into unmatched splendor, but the machine still needed to be fed. Every conquered land had to stay obedient. Every deported people carried memory. Every destroyed city left hatred. Every royal succession created danger. Every campaign stretched the army. Every act of terror solved one problem and planted another. Assyria was becoming the greatest empire the Near East had ever seen. And somewhere inside that greatness, the seeds of its fall were already growing. After Sennacherib was murdered by his own sons, the empire did not pause to grieve like a family. It tightened like a wounded animal. Assyria could terrify foreign kings, crush rebel cities, deport whole populations, and carve victory into stone, but even the greatest empire was vulnerable at the moment of succession. A dead king leaves more than a body. He leaves ambition. He leaves sons who believe the throne should be theirs. He leaves generals waiting to see whom they should obey. He leaves governors calculating whether the center is still strong. He leaves enemies listening carefully for weakness. And in Assyria, weakness was an invitation to rebellion. The man who emerged from this storm was Esarhaddon. He was not the obvious peaceful heir walking gently into power. He had to fight for it. His brothers, connected with the murder of Sennacherib, challenged him. The empire watched, Babylon watched, the West watched, every province watched. If Esarhaddon failed, Assyria's enemies might rise from every border. But Esarhaddon moved with the kind of determination Assyrian kings needed. He defeated his rivals, took the throne, and presented his rise as the will of the gods. Like many ancient rulers, he could not allow his kingship to look like luck or politics alone. It had to look like destiny. The gods had chosen him, Ashur had chosen him, and now the empire had to obey. But Esarhaddon inherited something darker than a normal throne. He inherited the wound of Babylon. His father Sennacherib had destroyed Babylon, and that act, though born from years of frustration and rebellion, had shaken the religious and political conscience of Mesopotamia. Babylon was not just a city, it was the city of Marduk. It was ancient, sacred, prestigious, and central to the imagination of southern Mesopotamia. Assyria could defeat Babylon, but destroying it was another matter. A king could burn an enemy city and call it justice. But when the city was Babylon, the act could feel like sacrilege. Even if Assyria's army had won, the gods had to be answered. Esarhaddon understood this, so he did something remarkable. He reversed his father's policy and began rebuilding Babylon. This was not an act of soft weakness, it was brilliant politics. By restoring Babylon, Esarhaddon could present himself as the healer of a sacred wound. He could say that the destruction had been part of divine anger, but now the gods had commanded restoration. He could win Babylonian loyalty, or at least reduce Babylonian hatred. He could show that the Assyrian king was not merely a destroyer, but a restorer of cosmic order. In Mesopotamia, rebuilding a temple could be as political as winning a battle. Imagine Babylon after the destruction. Its walls damaged, its temples wounded, its people scattered or traumatized. The city that had once carried the pride of centuries sits under humiliation. Then Assyrian officials arrive, but not only with soldiers. They come with orders to rebuild, workers clear ruins, bricks are made, sacred spaces are prepared. Ritual experts discuss how to restore what was broken. The statue of Marduk or the proper divine presence in cult must be treated with reverence. The city must be brought back not only physically, but spiritually. Every brick is a message. Esarhaddon is not Sennacherib. Esarhaddon restores what his father destroyed, but do not mistake restoration for freedom. Babylon was being rebuilt under Assyrian power. The same empire that had crushed it now claimed credit for healing it. This is one of the strange patterns of imperial rule. The conqueror wounds, then presents himself as physician. Esarhaddon needed Babylon stable because Assyria needed the south. A rebellious Babylon drained resources. A loyal or pacified Babylon strengthened legitimacy. Rebuilding was mercy, piety, and strategy at the same time. Meanwhile, the empire continued to expand and fight. Esarhaddon was not only a restorer, he was a conqueror. His greatest military ambition turned toward Egypt. Egypt had long been the ancient giant of the south, older than almost every enemy Assyria had faced. Even weakened after the Bronze Age collapse and later political struggles, Egypt still carried immense prestige. Its temples, gold, history, and divine kingship made it more than another target. For an Assyrian king, conquering Egypt would mean reaching beyond the old limits of Near Eastern Empire. It would mean proving that even the land of pharaohs could be forced beneath Ashur's shadow. But Egypt was not easy. Distance alone made it difficult. From Assyria to Egypt, armies had to cross Syria, the Levant, desert routes, and dangerous supply lines. They had to pass through regions where local rulers might rebel or change sides. They had to face Egyptian and Kushite power because Egypt at this time was under the 25th dynasty, rulers of Kushite origin from Nubia who had taken control of Egypt and presented themselves as legitimate pharaohs. These kings were not weak puppets. They had their own sacred authority, military strength, and ambition. So when Assyria marched toward Egypt, it was not simply attacking a fading monument. It was confronting a living rival. Esarhaddon first faced setbacks. An early attempt to move against Egypt did not succeed. That matters because Assyria's victories often look inevitable when carved into inscriptions, but real campaigns could fail. Soldiers could die, supplies could run short, deserts could punish armies, enemy forces could resist. A king who wanted Egypt had to be patient and brutal enough to try again. In 671 BC, Esarhaddon launched a successful campaign. The Assyrian army pushed through the Levant and into Egypt, defeating the forces of Pharaoh Taharka. Memphis, one of Egypt's great ancient cities, was captured. Members of the royal family were taken. Assyria claimed victory over Egypt, and Esarhaddon took titles that proclaimed his domination of the land. For a moment, the empire of Ashur had reached the Nile. Think about the symbolism. Assyria, once a northern Mesopotamian city-state built around Ashur on the Tigris, now claimed power over Egypt, the land of pyramids and pharaohs. 1,000 years earlier, Assyrian merchants had worried about caravans and silver. Now an Assyrian king had entered the heart of one of the oldest civilizations on earth. The scale of that transformation is astonishing. Imagine the Assyrian army entering Memphis. Egyptian temples stand under a sun different from Assyria's. The Nile flows nearby, indifferent and eternal. Local people watch foreign soldiers move through sacred streets. Assyrian commanders count treasure, captives, and political hostages. Egyptian officials wonder who will be allowed to remain in power. Priests fear for the temples. The old world of pharaohs has not ended, but it has been humiliated. The king from distant Assyria has reached into Egypt and taken its ancient pride in his hands, but conquering Egypt was easier than holding it. That is another lesson repeated throughout history. An army can win a campaign, but administration across distance is harder. Egypt was far from Assyria. It had deep traditions, local elites, difficult geography, and strong resistance. Taharka retreated but did not vanish. Egyptian rebellion remained possible. Assyrian control depended on local governors, vassal rulers, garrisons, intimidation, and repeated intervention. The farther an empire stretches, the more expensive victory becomes. Esarhaddon knew the problem was not finished. When Egypt rebelled again, he prepared another campaign. But before he could complete it, he died in 669 BC while on the way to deal with the Egyptian crisis. Again, the empire faced the danger of succession. But Esarhaddon had tried to solve this before death came. He knew the Assyrian royal family could destroy itself. He had seen what happened after Sennacherib. He had fought his own brothers. He understood that a succession crisis could invite rebellion across the empire. So he arranged the future carefully. His son Ashurbanipal would become king of Assyria. Another son, Shamash-Shumukin, would become king of Babylon under Assyrian supremacy. Esarhaddon forced nobles, officials, and vassals to swear loyalty oaths supporting this arrangement. These succession treaties were meant to bind the empire before the old king died. It was a clever plan. It was also a dangerous plan, because giving one son Assyria and another Babylon placed brother beside brother, crown beside crown, ambition beside ambition. For a time it might work, but later the relationship between Ashurbanipal and Shamash-Shumukin would become one of the most dramatic and destructive conflicts in Assyrian history. You will see that soon. The empire's greatest scholar king would eventually face a rebellion led by his own brother in Babylon, and the consequences would be terrible. For now, remember only this: Esarhaddon tried to prevent civil war by dividing royal authority, but inside that solution he planted the seed of another crisis. When Ashurbanipal took the throne of Assyria, he inherited an empire at terrifying scale. Assyria controlled Mesopotamia, much of Syria and the Levant, parts of Anatolia's edge, and influenced deep into Egypt. Its armies had crossed into lands earlier kings had only dreamed of controlling. Its palaces were filled with tribute. Its scribes recorded omens, letters, taxes, and campaigns. Its enemies feared its punishments. Its cities, especially Nineveh, stood as monuments to imperial power. Ashurbanipal is one of the most fascinating rulers in ancient history because he breaks the simple image of the Assyrian king. He was a warrior, yes. He could be ruthless, yes. His reign included brutal campaigns, crushing of rebellions, and terrifying punishment, but he was also a scholar. He was trained in scribal arts, proud of his ability to read complex texts, and deeply interested in collecting knowledge. Under him, the Library of Nineveh became one of the greatest collections of ancient Mesopotamian learning. Myths, omens, rituals, medical texts, lexical lists, prayers, epics, astronomical observations, and scholarly tablets were gathered, copied, and stored. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest literary masterpieces, survived in large part because tablets from Ashurbanipal's library were discovered thousands of years later. That is the contradiction of Ashurbanipal, a king of violence who preserved wisdom, a ruler who could destroy cities and collect literature, a man who hunted lions and studied tablets. Conqueror whose library became one of the greatest gifts to world history. This is why Assyria cannot be reduced to one word. If we say only brutal, we miss the scholarship. If we say only civilized, we hide the terror. Assyria was both, and Ashurbanipal embodied that contradiction more than anyone. Imagine the young Ashurbanipal being trained before he expected to rule. He learns not only weapons and royal protocol, but writing, languages, omens, rituals, and ancient texts. He studies the signs pressed into clay, the wisdom of old Babylonia, the science of divination, the meaning of stars, the language of kings before him. He understands that knowledge is power because the king must know the will of the gods. He must read omens. He must interpret warnings. He must preserve ancient traditions. In Assyria, scholarship was not separate from rule. It was part of rule. Then imagine the same man later in his palace, receiving reports of rebellion, ordering campaigns, overseeing punishments, and hunting lions in royal ceremonies. His hands, or at least his commands, touch both tablets and blood. He wants to master the universe in two ways, through conquest and through knowledge. The land must submit to his army. The past must submit to his library. The gods must speak through omens he can read. The world must be gathered under his gaze. At the beginning of his reign, Egypt remained a major concern. Assyria had conquered Memphis under Esarhaddon, but Egypt was not truly pacified. Taharqa remained a threat, and later Tanutaman, another Kushite ruler, challenged Assyrian control. Ashurbanipal sent campaigns to restore Assyrian dominance. The Assyrians eventually pushed deep into Egypt, and Thebes, one of the most sacred and ancient cities in the world, was sacked in 663 BC. The sack of Thebes shocked the ancient world. Thebes was not just another city. It was the city of Amun, home to vast temples, sacred wealth, and centuries of Egyptian religious prestige. To see it plundered by Assyria was like watching one of the pillars of the old world crack. The Assyrian army had reached into Egypt's spiritual heart. The event echoed far beyond Egypt. Later biblical texts remember the fall of No-Ammon, meaning Thebes, as a warning that even great cities can fall. Imagine Thebes before the sack, temples rising beside the Nile. Columns covered in sacred carvings, priests serving ancient gods, storehouses holding wealth accumulated over generations, people who believed their city stood under divine protection. Then Assyrian forces arrived, distant northerners from a hard empire of iron and terror. The sacred city is stripped, treasure is taken, captives are led away. The shock is not only political, it is cosmic. If Thebes can fall, what city is safe? Yet Assyria did not hold Egypt permanently. The distance was too great, the local resistance too deep, the cost too high. Egyptian rulers, especially Psamtik-I, eventually restored independence and founded a new Egyptian dynasty. Assyria had shown it could invade and devastate Egypt, but not keep it forever. This matters because it shows the limits of even the greatest Assyrian power. The empire could reach farther than any before it, but every mile added strain. Egypt was a prize, but also a burden. Like many imperial victories, it glittered more brightly in inscription than in long-term control. Ashurbanipal also faced conflict in Elam, the powerful region to the east of southern Mesopotamia. Elam had long been involved in Babylonian and Mesopotamian affairs, often supporting anti-Assyrian movements. The Assyrians fought repeated wars against Elam, and Ashurbanipal eventually devastated the Elamite kingdom with extraordinary brutality. His inscriptions describe destruction, humiliation, and the breaking of Elamite royal power. The city of Susa, ancient and prestigious, suffered terrible punishment. Assyrian revenge against Elam was fierce because Elam had been a persistent enemy and supporter of Babylonian resistance. Again, we see the pattern. Assyria did not want only to win battles, it wanted to end the ability of enemies to return. But the more brutally it punished, the more it filled the world with memories of hatred. Elam's destruction may have removed a threat for a time, but it also revealed the empire at its harshest. Inside the empire, wealth flowed toward the center. Nineveh grew magnificent, palaces expanded, gardens, canals, and royal spaces displayed power. Tribute from the west, metals, timber, horses, ivory, luxury goods, captives, skilled workers, and strange animals moved into Assyria. The empire gathered the world materially just as Ashurbanipal gathered the world intellectually in his library. Nineveh became a city where conquest and knowledge lived side by side. Picture Nineveh at its height, massive walls, gates crowded with soldiers, merchants, officials, captives, and envoys, palaces filled with carved reliefs. Courtyards where tribute is presented, scribes copying tablets in quiet rooms, scholars debating omens, royal hunts staged with deadly precision, canals bringing water, gardens displaying plants and trees from conquered lands, foreign languages spoken in streets because deportation and empire have pulled peoples together. The city is not only Assyrian, it is the empire made visible, but beneath the beauty tension grows, because Ashurbanipal's brother Shamash-Shumukin rules Babylon. At first, the arrangement made by Esarhaddon holds. Ashurbanipal is king of Assyria, the superior power. Shamash-Shumukin is king of Babylon, but under his brother's shadow. Imagine what that feels like, to rule Babylon, the sacred city of Marduk, but know that your brother in Nineveh holds greater authority. To wear a crown but not be free. To sit in the south among Babylonian elites who resent Assyria, while your brother commands the empire that dominates you. Over time, this arrangement becomes unbearable. Babylonian pride, local resentment, and royal ambition begin to gather around Shamash-Shumukin. He is not merely a puppet with no identity. He is a king in one of the most prestigious cities on earth. Around him are people who remember Sennacherib's destruction, Esarhaddon's rebuilding, and the long humiliation of Assyrian dominance. They may look at Shamash-Shumukin and whisper that he should be more than his brother's subordinate. They may encourage him. They may promise support. Elam, Arab groups, Chaldeans, and others may become part of a wider anti-Assyrian coalition. The old hatred stored by Assyrian rule begins to find a royal face. This is the moment when Esarhaddon's succession plan begins to turn poisonous. 2 brothers, 2 crowns, 1 empire, 1 sacred city that hates submission, and 1 Assyrian king who cannot allow rebellion, even from his own blood. Coming war between Ashurbanipal and Shamash-Shumukin will be one of the most tragic chapters of Assyrian history. It will show the empire's strength but also its sickness. Because when the king of Assyria must destroy his own brother in Babylon, the empire is no longer only fighting enemies. It is fighting the contradictions inside itself. For now, the storm is gathering. Nineveh shines, the library grows, the armies still march, Egypt has been humbled, Elam is under pressure, tribute flows. Ashurbanipal sits at the peak of Assyrian power, surrounded by tablets, reliefs, scholars, soldiers, lions, gods, and conquered wealth. To the outside world, Assyria may look unstoppable, but remember this carefully. At the highest point, the fall is already being prepared. The empire has stretched far, it has humiliated many, it has uprooted peoples. It has wounded Babylon, Elam, Egypt, Israel, and countless smaller kingdoms. It has built order through fear. And now fear has created enemies everywhere, waiting for the moment when Assyria turns inward. That moment is coming. In the quiet rooms of Nineveh, scribes copy the old stories of Gilgamesh, a king who searched for immortality and learned that even the greatest men cannot escape death. Outside those rooms, Ashurbanipal rules an empire that seems almost immortal, but the tablets know better. No king lives forever, no city stands forever, no empire can make the whole world afraid forever. And soon, the brother in Babylon will light the fire that shows how fragile the empire of fear truly is. The fire that would expose Assyria's weakness did not begin at the edge of the empire. It began inside the royal family in Babylon under a crown placed there by an Assyrian father who had hoped to prevent civil war. Esarhaddon had tried to solve the problem before it happened. He had given Assyria to Ashurbanipal and Babylon to Shamash-Shumukin. On paper, it looked careful. One son would rule the empire from Nineveh. The other would rule the sacred city of Babylon. The nobles had sworn loyalty. The gods had been invoked. The succession had been arranged before the old king died. It was meant to avoid the bloodshed that had followed Sennacherib's murder. But human ambition does not always obey clay tablets. Oaths can delay rivalry, but they cannot erase it. And Babylon was not just any throne. Babylon was old. Babylon was sacred. Babylon was proud. To sit in Babylon and still answer to a brother in Nineveh was not kingship in full. It was kingship under a shadow. For years, Shamash-Shumukin lived inside that shadow. Imagine him in Babylon, surrounded by priests, nobles, scribes, old temples, and the memory of Marduk. Every street whispered history. Every ritual reminded him that Babylon had once stood at the center of the world. The city remembered Hammurabi. It remembered old dynasties. It remembered being destroyed by Sennacherib. It remembered being rebuilt by Esarhaddon. It remembered humiliation. And now its king was the brother of the Assyrian ruler, but not his equal. Officially, peace held. Practically, resentment grew. Babylonian elites had reasons to dislike Assyrian domination. Chaldean groups in the south had their own ambitions. Elam to the east had long supported anti-Assyrian movements. Arab groups, Western rulers, and distant enemies all understood that if Babylon rose, Assyria might be shaken from within. This is the dangerous thing about an empire ruled by fear. People may obey for years, but obedience is not the same as loyalty. Fear pushes hatred underground. It does not remove it, it stores it. Assyria had deported peoples, crushed cities, humiliated kings, demanded tribute, and presented its rule as the order of Ashur. For a long time that worked, but every conquered land remembered. Every injured kingdom waited. Every rival watched the royal family. If two Assyrian princes turned against each other, the enemies of Assyria would not see a family dispute. They would see an opening. Shamash-Shumukin eventually rebelled against Ashurbanipal. This was not a small local uprising. It was a royal challenge from Babylon itself, wrapped in the prestige of one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. The rebellion gathered support from many who hated Assyrian power or hoped to profit from its weakness. Elam became involved. Chaldeans and Arameans in Babylonia joined. Arab groups may have supported the revolt. The south of Mesopotamia stirred against the north. For Ashurbanipal, this was more than betrayal. It was a threat to the entire imperial structure. If Babylon could break free under his own brother, then every province might wonder whether Assyria could still command obedience. Picture Nineveh when the news hardens into certainty. Messengers arrive, reports are read, Babylon has turned. Shamash-Shumukin is not merely delaying tribute or arguing over status. He has chosen rebellion. Around Ashurbanipal stand generals, scholars, officials, and court advisors. The king who collected ancient wisdom now faces the oldest problem of monarchy, blood against blood. If he hesitates, he looks weak. If he forgives, others may rebel. If he destroys Babylon, he risks repeating the sacrilege of Sennacherib. If he destroys his brother, he stains the royal house. Every choice is poisonous, but Assyrian kings were not trained to tolerate rebellion. Ashurbanipal chooses war. The war between the brothers becomes brutal and drawn out. Babylon, protected by its walls and sacred status, does not simply fall at once. The city resists. Assyrian forces tighten around it. The rebellion spreads across regions, but Ashurbanipal's machine is still powerful. The empire has armies, siege experience, supply systems, intelligence, and a long practice of crushing enemies. Yet this war is different emotionally because the enemy is not a distant mountain ruler or a western vassal. The enemy is Babylon, and the rebel king is the Assyrian king's own brother. Imagine Babylon under siege. The city that had once been rebuilt as an act of healing now becomes a cage, gates close, food becomes scarce. The population waits, hoping for allies, hoping for Elam, hoping for a break in Assyrian pressure. Priests continue rituals, officials try to maintain order. Supporters of Shamash-Shumukin tell the people that Babylon must not bow forever to Nineveh. But siege is a slow enemy. It enters through hunger before it enters through gates. It makes people count grain, then crumbs, then days. It turns political pride into empty stomachs. It makes noble speeches sound thinner each week. Outside the city, Assyrian forces wait with the patience of a state that has broken many walls before. They know time is a weapon, they know hunger works, they know that allies cannot always arrive. They know that inside the city, fear will become anger, anger will become blame, and blame will weaken unity. Ashurbanipal does not need to rush if the city is starving. Assyria has learned that a siege is not only a battle of stone, it is a battle of human endurance. As the siege deepens, the situation inside Babylon becomes desperate. Ancient sources suggest famine and horrific suffering. Whether every detail is shaped by royal rhetoric or not, the reality of siege starvation is beyond doubt. People trapped inside a city can become victims of decisions made by kings far above them. A rebellion chosen by elites becomes hunger for children. A brother's ambition becomes grief for families. A sacred city becomes a place where survival strips away dignity. This is one of the hardest truths in ancient history. The names we remember are kings: Ashurbanipal, Shamash-Shumukin, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon. But the people who paid the deepest price were often nameless. A woman in Babylon who had no voice in the rebellion still watched food vanish. A child too young to understand Assyria or Marduk still felt hunger. A craftsman who only wanted work still found himself trapped between royal pride and imperial punishment. History records the brothers. The city carried the pain. Finally, Babylon fell. Shamash-Shumukin died, possibly in the flames of his palace, though the details remain shadowed by hostile sources and dramatic memory. Ashurbanipal had won. The brother in Babylon was gone. The rebellion was crushed. Assyria had survived its internal crisis, but victory had a cost. Ashurbanipal did not destroy Babylon in the same total symbolic way Sennacherib had done, but the city suffered terribly. The rebellion's supporters were punished. Elam, which had supported anti-Assyrian resistance, became a major target of vengeance. Ashurbanipal's war against Elam was relentless. The Assyrians invaded, defeated Elamite rulers, looted cities, and eventually devastated Susa, one of the ancient centers of Elamite civilization. In Assyrian inscriptions, the destruction of Elam is described with chilling triumph. Royal tombs were violated, the land was humiliated, the enemy's identity was attacked not only politically but spiritually and historically. To Ashurbanipal, this was justice. Elam had supported rebellion. Elam had been a thorn in Assyria's side for generations. Elam had helped Babylon resist. Therefore, Elam had to be broken so deeply that it could not return as the same threat. To Assyria's enemies, this was horror. To modern eyes, it reveals the empire at its most merciless. The scholar king who preserved Gilgamesh also shattered Susa. The man who collected wisdom also ordered devastation. Again, Assyria refuses to become simple. Imagine the Elamite city after Assyria arrives: temples stripped, palaces looted, royal graves disturbed, people taken. The old pride of Elam dragged into the Assyrian record as proof of Ashurbanipal's power. The empire wants more than victory. It wants to rewrite the enemy's memory. It wants to show that resisting Assyria does not merely lose a war. It risks losing ancestors, gods, tombs, and the dignity of the past. This is how fear reaches beyond the living. Yet while Assyria was crushing enemies, Nineveh was becoming magnificent. This is the strange split screen of Ashurbanipal's reign. On one side, war, siege, famine, revenge, deportation, and the destruction of Elam. On the other side, libraries, scholarship, palace art, royal hunts, gardens, and the gathering of ancient knowledge. Nineveh became one of the greatest cities in the world. Its palaces were filled with reliefs that showed the king as hunter, conqueror, ruler, and master of chaos. Its archives held tablets copied from older Babylonian and Assyrian traditions. Myths, rituals, omens, medical texts, dictionaries, prayers, epics, astronomical observations, the intellectual inheritance of Mesopotamia was brought into the royal collection. Why would a warrior king care so much about tablets? Because knowledge was power. In Mesopotamian thought, the world was full of signs. The gods spoke through stars, dreams, omens, animal behavior, birth defects, eclipses, storms, and strange events. A king who could understand these signs could act before disaster. Scholars were not decorative book collectors. They were part of the state's nervous system. They read the heavens. They interpreted warnings. They advised rituals. They helped the king maintain order between heaven and earth. Ashurbanipal's library was not a hobby in the modern sense. It was kingship written in clay. Picture a quiet room in Nineveh while war reports arrive elsewhere in the palace. A scribe copies an old tablet by lamplight. He carefully presses signs into clay, preserving a myth already ancient in his own time. Another scholar checks a series of omens. Another prepares a report for the king. Outside, tribute bearers pass through palace courts. Soldiers return from campaigns. Captives are counted. But inside the scholarly rooms, another kind of conquest is happening. Assyria is conquering memory. It is gathering the words of older civilizations and placing them under the protection of the king. Among these texts is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of the king of Uruk who sought immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu. Gilgamesh travels, suffers, learns, and ultimately discovers that human beings cannot escape death. Think of the irony. Ashurbanipal, ruler of the most powerful empire of his age, preserves a story whose deepest lesson is that no king lives forever. The tablet sat in Nineveh, inside an empire that seemed unstoppable, carrying a warning the empire itself could not avoid. No matter how many cities Assyria conquered, no matter how many enemies it terrified, no matter how many gods it invoked, no empire could become immortal. The palace reliefs of Ashurbanipal's lion hunts carry the same contradiction. They show the king mastering lions with terrifying control. The lions are carved with extraordinary realism, wounded, roaring, collapsing, still dignified in death. The king appears calm, almost beyond danger. The message is royal power over chaos. But to us, the wounded lions feel almost like the empire's victims, beautiful and doomed beneath a machine of control. Assyrian art wanted to glorify the king. It also accidentally preserved the pain of what he conquered. Nineveh at its peak must have felt like the center of the world. Envoys from distant lands, goods from mountains, deserts, coasts, and river valleys, officials moving through administrative buildings, soldiers in disciplined units, scholars working over tablets. Gardens watered by engineering projects, massive walls protecting the city, palaces decorated with scenes of total domination. The empire had never looked greater, and that is exactly why its fall will be so shocking. At the peak, Assyria seemed impossible to overthrow. But the same reign that displayed its greatest cultural brilliance also revealed its deepest exhaustion. The war with Shamash-Shumukin had been internal and devastating. The wars against Elam were brutal. Egypt had slipped away from permanent Assyrian control. The western provinces required constant attention. Babylon remained emotionally dangerous. The empire had too many enemies and too many memories of cruelty behind it. Ashurbanipal could defeat rebellions while he lived, but what would happen after him? That question is the crack beneath Nineveh's marble. Strong kings hide structural weakness. While Ashurbanipal lived and commanded, the empire still functioned. Enemies were crushed, rebellions punished, the library grew, the palace shone. But an empire built on fear needs a feared center. It needs a king whose name makes rebels hesitate. It needs armies ready to move. It needs governors loyal. It needs succession to be clear. If the center becomes uncertain, the outer lands do not remain grateful. They remember chains, they remember deportations, they remember tribute, they remember burned cities, and they rise. After Ashurbanipal, the record becomes more confused. That confusion itself tells us something. The clear voice of Assyrian confidence begins to break. Succession struggles appear. Royal authority weakens. Assyria still exists, still has armies, still has cities, still has tradition, but the rhythm changes. The empire is no longer expanding with unstoppable clarity. It is trying to hold itself together. Babylon becomes independent under Nabopolassar, a Chaldean leader who will become one of Assyria's great destroyers. The Medes rise in the east under Cyaxares. Former subjects and enemies begin to move against the empire. The stored hatred is finding its moment, but before we reach the final fall, stay one moment longer in Nineveh at its height. This is important because collapse is only meaningful when we understand what is about to be lost. Imagine the city at dusk. The sun lowers over the Tigris. Palace walls glow with warm light. Lamassu guard the gates with massive calm. Reliefs show armies, hunts, tribute, and victories. In the library, rows of tablets dry or rest on shelves. A scholar carries a text copied from Babylon. A soldier returns from a campaign against Elam. A deported craftsman works on royal construction, far from the land of his birth. An envoy from a western kingdom waits to present tribute. A priest watches the sky for signs. Somewhere in the palace, Ashurbanipal hears reports from across the empire. He is surrounded by the world he has gathered. To an Assyrian loyalist, this is order. To a conquered envoy, it is fear. To a deported worker, it is exile. To a scholar, it is the preservation of wisdom. To a future archaeologist, it will be a treasure. To history, it is the last great brightness before the dark, because the empire is not healthy just because the palace is beautiful. A body can wear gold while fever grows inside. Assyria's fever is succession, overextension, hatred, and the burden of ruling too many unwilling peoples through terror. The machine still turns, but it is wearing itself down. Every campaign costs, every rebellion requires punishment. Every deportation solves one problem and creates another memory of grief. Every crushed enemy leaves relatives, survivors, and neighboring kings who understand that mercy will not come if they fail, so they must wait for Assyria to weaken and strike hard when the moment arrives. And that moment is approaching. Babylon, wounded and humiliated for generations, will not remain quiet. The Medes, strong in the east, will not remain distant. Assyria's own succession troubles will weaken the center. The great cities that once sent armies outward will soon face armies coming inward. The empire that taught the world to fear siege will learn what it means to be besieged. And Nineveh, the city of palaces, libraries, lions, lamassu, and royal pride, will one day hear enemy footsteps outside its own walls. For now the lamps still burn, the tablets still sit in ordered rows, the king still rules, the empire still looks eternal. But the old epic of Gilgamesh waits silently in the library, carrying its ancient truth through the dust. No king lives forever, no wall stands forever, no empire escapes the day when its enemies stop trembling. The first cracks after Ashurbanipal did not look like the fall of the world. That is how collapse often begins. Not with a final scream, not with palace walls falling in one night, not with enemies already inside the gates, but with uncertainty. A king dies, another claims the throne, a brother challenges him, governors hesitate, provinces delay tribute. Messengers take longer to return, old enemies begin speaking to one another again. A border that was once quiet becomes restless. A city that used to bow now asks whether Assyria is still strong enough to punish it. On the surface, the empire still looks enormous. Nineveh still stands, Ashur still has temples, Kalhu still carries royal memory, Haran still matters, the roads still exist, the army still exists, the palace reliefs still show victory. The library tablets still sleep in their rooms, but under the surface something has changed. The empire of fear depends on one thing above all: people must believe the fear is still real. For generations, Assyria had taught the Near East that rebellion was dangerous. A city that resisted could be surrounded. A king who betrayed could be chained. A population could be deported. A rebellious land could become a province. Palace walls from Nineveh to Nimrud carved the message into stone. Assyria sees, Assyria comes, Assyria punishes, Assyria remembers. That memory made rulers think twice before resisting, but after Ashurbanipal, the center became less clear. The royal succession grew troubled, the records become harder to follow. The confident voice of Assyrian kings begins to sound less continuous, and in the ancient world, uncertainty at the top was never private. It traveled outward like a smell of blood in water. Babylon felt it. Babylon had been wounded again and again by Assyrian power. It had been dominated, destroyed, restored, ruled, punished, and watched. Sennacherib had once devastated it. Esarhaddon had rebuilt it. Ashurbanipal had crushed his own brother's rebellion there. Babylon was sacred, proud, and exhausted by northern control. Its priests, nobles, Chaldean leaders, and ordinary people carried a long memory of humiliation. Assyria could occupy Babylon, crown kings over Babylon, rebuild Babylon, and punish Babylon, but it could never make Babylon forget that it had once been the heart of Mesopotamian greatness. Then came Nabopolassar. He was a Chaldean leader who rose in Babylon and became the founder of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. At first, he was not the master of the world. He was a rebel king fighting against the most feared empire in memory, but timing is everything in history. Had Nabopolassar risen during the strongest years of Tiglath-Pileser III or Sennacherib or Ashurbanipal, he might have been crushed and remembered only as another failed rebel. But he rose when Assyria was weakened by succession troubles, overextension, and enemies gathering at the edges. He did not have to defeat the Assyria of its greatest confidence. He had to survive long enough for Assyria's enemies to realize the giant could bleed. Imagine Babylon when Nabopolassar's movement begins to harden into real power. In the temples, priests watch carefully. In the streets, people whisper. Is this another rebellion that will end in Assyrian punishment, or is this the moment Babylon has waited for? Chaldean warriors gather, local elites calculate, some fear Assyria's return, others believe the old terror has lost its teeth. The memory of Assyrian sieges hangs over every decision. To rebel against Assyria is not a symbolic act, it is to risk destruction. But submission has become unbearable and the empire no longer looks invincible. Nabopolassar fought for years to push Assyria out of Babylonia. This was not one clean battle. It was a hard struggle across cities, canals, fields, and ancient centers. Assyria did not simply collapse the moment Babylon stood up. The Assyrians fought back. They still had armies, fortresses, experience, and pride, but the old rhythm had shifted. The empire was no longer always on the attack. Now it was defending what it had once assumed it owned. That is a dangerous emotional change for an empire. The ruler who once decided which city to punish now has to decide which city he can still hold. At the same time, a new power was rising in the east, the Medes. The Medes were an Iranian people whose power grew in the highlands east of Mesopotamia. For Assyria, eastern mountain peoples had always been a challenge, but by the late 7th century BC, the Medes became more than another frontier problem. Under Cyaxares, they emerged as a serious force capable of striking into Assyria itself. This mattered because Assyria's enemies had often failed when they fought separately. A rebellious western city could be crushed. Babylon alone could be punished. A mountain group could be campaigned against. But when Babylon and the Medes aligned, Assyria faced something far more dangerous, enemies from different directions, one with the ancient prestige of Babylon and the other with rising military strength from the east. This is where the Empire of Fear faced the consequence of its own history. Assyria had spent generations creating enemies. It had humiliated Babylon. It had fought Elam. It had threatened Egypt. It had deported peoples from Israel, Syria, Babylonia, and beyond. It had forced tribute from kingdoms that hated it. It had built an order based on submission, not love. While Assyria was strong, that hatred stayed contained. But once Babylon and the Medes began moving seriously against it, old fear started turning into opportunity. The first great Assyrian cities began to fall. Ashur, the sacred old city, the original heart of Assyria, fell in 614 BC to the Medes. This was not just a military loss, it was spiritual devastation. Ashur was the city of the god Ashur, the root of Assyrian identity, the place from which the empire's sacred mission had grown. For enemies to take Ashur was like cutting into the oldest artery of the state. Nineveh was the imperial capital of later greatness, but Ashur was the soul. When Ashur fell, the message was unmistakable. The god's own city was no longer beyond reach. Imagine the panic when word reaches Nineveh: Ashur has fallen. The old city, the sacred city, the city whose name was God and homeland together. Officials rush through palace corridors, priests search for ritual answers, soldiers are called, messengers are sent, some deny the scale of the disaster, others understand immediately. If Ashur can fall, then the world has changed. The empire that once made others fear for their temples now fears for its own. What happened inside Ashur in those final hours is hard to reconstruct in personal detail, but we can imagine the emotional violence of it. Priests in the temple of Ashur hearing enemy forces approaching. Families hiding valuables, soldiers trying to hold gates, old people remembering the empire's glory and not understanding how enemies reached this place. The city that had sent fear outward for centuries now receives fear at its own walls. This reversal is one of the most powerful moments in ancient history. Assyria's methods had returned to Assyria. After Ashur fell, Nineveh became the great target. Nineveh was not just a city. It was the symbol of Assyrian imperial magnificence. Sennacherib had transformed it into a capital without rival. Ashurbanipal had filled it with palace art, royal archives, hunting scenes, conquest reliefs, and the great library. Lamassu guarded its gates, walls surrounded it. Canals and gardens showed engineering power. Its palaces contained the memory of campaigns from Egypt to Elam. Tribute from countless lands had passed through it. Captives had worked for it. Scholars had copied tablets inside it. Envoys had trembled inside its halls. Nineveh was Assyria's pride made visible, and now the enemies were coming for it. In 612 BC, the Babylonians under Nabopolassar and the Medes under Cyaxares, along with allies, attacked Nineveh. The siege became the final nightmare of the Assyrian world. The city that had watched so many others starve and break now had to endure the same pressure. The walls that had once framed scenes of Assyrian siege engines now faced enemy armies. The people who had lived at the center of the empire heard the sound that Assyria had taught others to fear. Soldiers outside the walls, camps forming, gates threatened, supplies becoming precious, rumors spreading, hope narrowing. Imagine Nineveh during the siege. At first there is confidence. The walls are strong. The city is great. Assyria has survived crisis before. The army will respond. The gods will protect. The memory of past victories is everywhere. A man walking through the palace can still see carved scenes of defeated enemies, but those carvings now feel different. What once looked like proof of eternity now looks like accusation. Assyria had done this to others. Now others are doing it to Assyria. Days pass, then more. The attackers press harder. The river and weather may have played a role in the city's fall, with later traditions suggesting flooding or breaches, though details remain debated. But whether by siege, assault, flood damage, betrayal, exhaustion, or altogether, Nineveh's defenses failed. The city was taken. The palaces burned. The empire's greatest capital fell into fire. The fall of Nineveh must have been terrifying beyond words. Imagine the library rooms as flames spread. Clay tablets fall from shelves, some break, some bake harder in the heat, preserving the words that will one day teach the future about Mesopotamia. Again, destruction becomes preservation. The same fire that kills the empire protects parts of its memory. The Epic of Gilgamesh, omen series, rituals, letters, lexical lists, and royal texts survive because the palace burns. Assyria's last disaster becomes humanity's archive. In the streets, ordinary people suffer what imperial language usually hides. Families flee, soldiers fight and fall, officials try to save records or treasure, priests carry sacred objects if they can, smoke fills courtyards. The massive lamassu at the gates stand helpless as men rush beneath them. The palace reliefs, carved to make enemies tremble, crack under heat. The city that once gathered tribute from the world is looted by the world it frightened, and somewhere in this chaos the Assyrian king dies or disappears from meaningful power. Sin-Shar-ishkun, one of the last Assyrian rulers, likely perished during the fall of Nineveh. His exact end is shadowed, but the result is clear. The central Assyrian imperial state was broken. A final Assyrian ruler, Ashurbanipal II, would attempt to continue resistance from Haran, supported for a time by Egypt, but the empire's heart had been destroyed. The Assyrian war machine could still twitch, but it could no longer dominate the Near East. Pause on that detail. Egypt supported the last Assyrian resistance. How strange history is. Assyria had invaded Egypt. Assyrian armies had sacked Thebes. Assyrian kings had humiliated pharaohs. Yet in the final years, Egypt saw Babylon and the Medes rising and understood that Assyria's fall would change the balance of power. Former enemies can become useful when a greater danger appears. So Egypt tried to help what remained of Assyria, not out of love, but because politics does not care about old hatred when new threats grow. Still, it was not enough. Haran fell in 610 BC, attempts to retake it failed, the last Assyrian hopes faded. By 609 BC, the empire that had ruled through fear was gone as a great power. Gone, a word too small for what happened. The empire that had stretched from Iran's edges to Egypt's borders, from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf, from mountain fortresses to desert routes, was shattered. Its capitals were burned or taken. Its royal line disappeared from history. Its enemies divided the world it had once dominated. Babylon rose under Nabopolassar and later his son Nebuchadnezzar II. The Medes became a major force. Egypt remained active but would soon lose influence in the Levant. The map had changed. But what happened to the Assyrian people? This is important. The Assyrian Empire fell, but the people did not vanish into air. Farmers, craftsmen, families, priests, local communities, and speakers of Aramaic and Assyrian traditions continued living in the region. Political empire disappeared, but human life continued. Later empires ruled over Assyrian lands: Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Parthian, Roman, Sasanian, Islamic, and many others across long centuries. The name Assyria remained in different forms. The cultural and human story continued, even after the imperial state died. Collapse of empire is not extinction of people. Still, the imperial fall was so complete that Assyria became a symbol of divine judgment in later traditions. In biblical memory, Nineveh could represent arrogance, violence, and the shocking reversal of power. The prophets spoke of Assyria's pride and downfall. For those who had suffered under Assyria, its fall was not merely political. It was moral. The terrorizer had been terrorized. The destroyer had been destroyed. City that said no enemy could touch it had become ruins. That moral reversal is one reason Assyria's story remains gripping. It feels like history answering violence with violence, but we should be careful. Assyria's fall may feel satisfying from the perspective of its victims, yet the actual fall meant suffering for many who were not kings or generals. Ordinary people in Nineveh paid for the crimes of empire. Children, workers, scribes, servants, and families died or fled in the catastrophe. That is the tragedy of imperial collapse. The rulers build hatred. The population absorbs revenge. Assyria had taught the ancient Near East that fear could hold an empire together. For a time it was right. Fear worked. It brought tribute. It broke resistance. It filled palaces. It moved populations. It carved a new imperial map. But fear is not the same as loyalty. Fear is a frozen river. It looks solid until the thaw comes. After Ashurbanipal, the thaw came quickly. Babylon rose. The Medes struck. Allies gathered. Former subjects did not rush to save Assyria. Why would they? The empire had not built love, it had built obedience. When obedience was no longer forced, the structure collapsed. This does not mean Assyria contributed nothing but violence. That would also be false. Assyria preserved knowledge. It developed imperial administration. It built cities and roads. It created systems of communication and control that later empires would learn from. Its art remains among the most powerful of the ancient world. Its libraries preserved texts that would otherwise be lost. Its rulers understood logistics, intelligence, siegecraft, provincial government, and propaganda at a level that shaped imperial history. The Persian Empire, which rose later, would inherit and improve many Near Eastern imperial practices, including some that Assyria had helped pioneer. Even Rome, much later and far away, would face similar questions: roads, provinces, subject peoples, military frontiers, fear, loyalty, and the burden of expansion. Assyria was not a failure because it fell. Every empire falls eventually. Assyria matters because it showed how powerful a centralized military state could become, and how dangerous such power was when tied to divine mission, terror policy, and administrative genius. It was one of history's first true empires in the hard sense, not merely a kingdom with influence, but a state that absorbed many peoples, reorganized territories, moved populations, built provinces, and ruled through a combination of force, information, fear, and infrastructure. And yet, all of that could not save Nineveh. This is the image to hold, the library of Ashurbanipal burning as the empire falls. Inside those rooms were stories older than Assyria, myths from Sumer and Babylon, prayers, medical texts, omen tablets, dictionaries, rituals, and epics. The empire that destroyed so much also preserved the memory of civilizations before it. Its final fire could have erased that library completely, but instead it baked many tablets and helped them survive. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would uncover them. Modern people would read Gilgamesh again because Assyria, the empire of fear, had collected the text, and because Nineveh, the city of fear, had burned. History is full of uncomfortable debts. We owe part of our knowledge of ancient Mesopotamia to a brutal king's library. We know Assyrian cruelty partly because Assyrians proudly recorded it. We know the pain of their victims because the empire carved its own violence into stone. We know the fall because enemies and later traditions remembered the reversal. Assyria tried to make fear eternal. Instead, it made itself unforgettable. As the final part of this story comes toward rest, picture Nineveh after the fall. The fires have weakened. Smoke drifts above broken palace walls. The great reliefs are cracked. Lamassu stand damaged, still facing gates that no longer protect an empire. In the library ruins, clay tablets lie under debris, waiting in silence. The Tigris flows nearby as it always has, indifferent to kings. The sounds of Assyrian command are gone. No royal messenger rushes through corridors. No conquered envoy trembles before the throne. No scribe records another campaign of Ashur's chosen king. The palace without rival is now a palace without a ruler. Far south, Babylon rises again. Far east, the Medes claim their share of victory. Far west, the small kingdoms that feared Assyria begin to breathe, though new empires will come soon enough. And across the Near East, people speak of the impossible thing that happened: Nineveh fell. The empire that taught the world to fear walls being broken has had its own walls broken. The kings who deported nations have lost their own royal house. The city that carved enemies into stone has become a warning carved into memory. But in the deep quiet after destruction, Assyria's story does not vanish. It changes form. It becomes ruins. It becomes tablets. It becomes biblical memory. It becomes archaeological discovery. It becomes palace reliefs in museums. It becomes the first great lesson in how terror can build an empire, and how terror can leave that empire alone when enemies finally gather. The Assyrians began in Ashur, a city by the Tigris, with merchants, priests, scribes, and a god whose name became a mission. They rose through discipline, fear, iron, roads, sieges, deportations, and kings who believed the world must submit. They built Nineveh into a wonder. They preserved the wisdom of older ages. They ruled more lands than any Near Eastern power before them. And then almost suddenly after their greatest height, they fell so hard that their empire never returned. The final whisper of Assyria is not only that cruelty is punished. History is not always that clean. The deeper whisper is this: fear can force obedience, but it cannot create love. It can build walls, but not trust. It can fill palaces, but also fill the world with enemies. It can silence rebellion for a generation, but not erase memory. And when the center weakens, the people who bowed out of terror may rise not with mercy, but with everything they were forced to swallow. Nineveh sleeps now, Ashur sleeps, the kings are dust, the tablets remain. And somewhere in the broken library, Gilgamesh still asks the question that every empire tries to avoid: can greatness defeat death? Assyria's answer is written in ruins: no empire can live forever. But some fall so loudly that the world keeps hearing them long after their walls are gone. After Nineveh fell, the world did not become peaceful. That is the first thing to understand. The end of Assyria was not the end of war, cruelty, empire, or ambition. It was only the end of one empire's turn at the center of fear. The people who had prayed for Assyria's fall did not wake the next morning into a gentle age. They woke into a new struggle for power. Babylon rose, the Medes expanded, Egypt tried to protect its interests. Smaller kingdoms looked for space to breathe. Old roads were taken over by new armies. Old tribute routes changed direction. The imperial throne in Nineveh was empty, but the hunger that had built Assyria did not die with it. Power simply moved. This is one of history's hardest lessons. The fall of a cruel empire can feel like justice, and for many people who suffered under Assyria, it surely did. Imagine a family in Babylon hearing that Nineveh had fallen. Their grandparents may have remembered Sennacherib's destruction. Their parents may have remembered Ashurbanipal's war against his own brother. Their city had lived under Assyrian pressure for generations. To them, the fall of Nineveh may have sounded like divine balance, like the world correcting itself at last. But the relief would not last forever because Babylon's victory created a new empire, and new empires bring new demands. Nabopolassar, the Chaldean king who helped destroy Assyria, became the founder of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. His son, Nebuchadnezzar II, would become one of the most famous rulers of the ancient Near East. Babylon, once humiliated by Assyria, became magnificent again. Its walls, temples, palaces, and processional ways restored the city's ancient pride. The name of Babylon returned to the center of history. The city of Marduk, wounded and rebuilt, now stood over the lands Assyria had once dominated. In a way, Babylon inherited the world Assyria lost. But Babylon also inherited the problems of empire: rebellious Western kingdoms, Egyptian rivalry, military campaigns, deportations, and the need to prove that the new center could command obedience. The shadow of Assyria remained even after Assyria was gone. Babylon could hate Assyria, but it had learned from Assyria. The idea that a great power could control distant lands, punish rebels, deport populations, and use imperial administration did not disappear. When Nebuchadnezzar later captured Jerusalem and deported elites to Babylon, he was acting in a world Assyria had helped shape. Babylonians were not identical to the Assyrians, but the imperial logic was familiar. Rebellious small kingdoms could not be allowed to threaten the order of a great king. The names changed, the methods continued. This is why the Assyrian legacy is so disturbing. It did not die with Nineveh. Assyria proved that terror and administration could hold many peoples together for generations. Later empires watched, inherited, adapted, and improved. The Babylonians took over parts of the imperial stage. Then the Persians rose and created something even larger, but with a different style. The Persian Empire learned from the empires before it. It used roads, provinces, tribute, local elites, imperial messaging, and royal authority on a scale Assyria had helped make imaginable. Persia was often more flexible and less openly terroristic than Assyria, but it still inherited a world where empire had become a known political form. Assyria was gone, but empire had learned how to survive, and that is perhaps more important than any single battle. Before Assyria, there had been kingdoms, city-states, regional powers, and empires of earlier kinds. But Assyria showed the Near East the power of a highly militarized, centrally controlled, territorially organized state that could absorb many peoples and rule them through governors, roads, fear, records, and forced movement. It was not just a conquering kingdom. It was a machine of imperial control. Later powers would not copy everything, but they would live in the world Assyria had helped invent. Yet inside the ruins there were also survivors. We must not let the fall of the empire erase the Assyrian people. The royal state collapsed, but ordinary Assyrians did not vanish in one night. Farmers still farmed. Families still lived in northern Mesopotamia. Local traditions continued. Aramaic, already widely used across the empire, remained important. Cities and villages persisted under new rulers. The land that had once been the Assyrian heartland became part of later empires, but the people did not dissolve into dust simply because the palace line ended. This distinction matters. Empires fall in history books, but people continue in kitchens, fields, streets, and prayers. Imagine a family living near the old Assyrian heartland after the fall. They are not kings. They never ordered deportations. They never carved victory reliefs. They may have lost relatives in the final wars. Now they live under Babylonian or Median influence, then later Persian rule. They remember Assyrian names. They speak the language of daily life. They know old ruins nearby. They perhaps still honor local traditions, even as the great state is gone. To them, the fall of Assyria is not a moral lesson. It is the collapse of the world that organized their lives. They must survive the revenge aimed at kings. This is why history should be careful with judgment. Assyrian kings committed terrible acts. Assyrian policy caused enormous suffering, but a whole population is not the same as its royal inscriptions. Many ordinary Assyrians were also caught inside the machine, taxed by it, recruited by it, moved by it, and finally crushed when enemies came for revenge. The empire ruled through fear, but fear also ruled many inside the empire itself. After Nineveh's destruction, the great city became ruins, but ruins are not dead, they are sleeping arguments. For centuries, the mounds of ancient Assyrian cities stood in the landscape, hiding palaces, reliefs, tablets, gates, and broken statues beneath earth. Local people knew the mounds, travelers saw strange remains, ancient memory preserved fragments. Biblical texts remembered Nineveh, Assyria, and its violence. Greek writers had confused but interesting memories of Assyrian and Babylonian power. But the full reality of Assyria's empire, its archives, its palaces, its kings, and its art, waited underground. Then modern archaeology came. In the 19th century, explorers and archaeologists began excavating the great Assyrian sites, Nineveh, Nimrud, Khorsabad, and others. One of the most famous figures was Austin Henry Layard, who excavated at Nimrud and Nineveh and brought Assyrian reliefs and sculptures to European attention. Enormous winged bulls, carved reliefs of battles and hunts, royal inscriptions, and palace walls emerged from the mounds. The ancient empire that had terrified the Near East suddenly stood before the modern world in stone. Imagine the moment a lamassu is uncovered. The earth is cleared slowly. First a carved shape, then a wing, then a massive body, then a human face, calm and watchful after more than 2,000 years in darkness. This creature once guarded an Assyrian palace doorway, designed to impress and intimidate anyone who entered. Then the palace burned, the empire fell, and the guardian was buried. Now it rises again, not before trembling envoys, but before archaeologists, workers, artists, scholars, and eventually museum visitors. Its meaning changes, but its power remains. The reliefs shocked and fascinated the modern world. Here were scenes of ancient warfare with astonishing detail. Soldiers storming cities, siege ramps rising, captives led away, kings receiving tribute, animals hunted, rivers crossed, mountains conquered. The Assyrians had carved their own violence so carefully that thousands of years later we could still see how they wanted to be remembered. They did not hide terror, they made it art. Modern viewers could admire the skill and recoil from the message at the same time. That tension remains today. Assyrian art is magnificent, but it asks difficult questions about beauty in the service of power. Then came the tablets. The library of Ashurbanipal was one of the greatest discoveries in the history of ancient literature. Thousands of clay tablets and fragments were found at Nineveh. They preserved myths, rituals, medical texts, omen series, lexical lists, astronomical observations, prayers, royal inscriptions, and scholarly works. Among them were tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh. When scholars began reading these texts, Mesopotamian civilization spoke again with depth and complexity. The flood story in Gilgamesh drew special attention because of its parallels with biblical traditions. Suddenly, the deep literary world of ancient Mesopotamia became visible to modern readers. Think of the irony again. Assyria's capital burned in 612 BC. That fire helped bake clay tablets. Those tablets survived in ruined rooms. Thousands of years later, they became one of the greatest gifts Assyria accidentally gave the world. The empire that ruled through fear preserved stories older than itself. The king who boasted of destroying enemies collected literature that taught future generations about grief, friendship, mortality, and the limits of power. In the ruins of the most feared empire, modern humanity recovered one of its oldest poems. Gilgamesh stands like a quiet judgment over Assyria. The poem tells of a king who is powerful, restless, and afraid of death. He loses his friend, searches for immortality, and learns that human greatness cannot escape the final boundary. What better text could be found in the ruins of Nineveh? Assyria's kings had tried to make themselves eternal through conquest, inscriptions, palaces, and fear. But the city fell, the kings died, the empire vanished. Only clay remained, carrying a story that already knew the truth. No man, no king, no wall, no empire defeats death. The rediscovery of Assyria changed the modern understanding of the ancient Near East. Before archaeology, Assyria was often known mainly through biblical memory and classical references. It appeared as a violent empire, an instrument of judgment, a terrifying enemy. Archaeology did not erase that image, but it made it richer and more complicated. Assyria was indeed violent, but it was also literate, organized, artistic, religious, scholarly, and administratively sophisticated. Its kings were not simple brutes. They were imperial rulers operating within a complex worldview. Its cruelty was real, but so was its intelligence. This is what makes Assyria powerful as a story. It forces us to hold contradictions. A king can preserve wisdom and order massacres. A city can house a great library and terrorize half the world. A relief can be beautiful and morally horrifying. A road can improve communication and carry armies to destroy cities. A deportation policy can create administrative stability and human devastation. Assyria refuses to let us divide civilization neatly into light and darkness, and maybe that is why it matters so much. The Assyrian Empire shows how civilization can become dangerous when organization serves domination without restraint. Assyria was not terrifying because it was chaotic. It was terrifying because it was organized. It had records, roads, provinces, intelligence, engineers, supply systems, ideology, and art. It proved that bureaucracy and brutality can work together. It proved that a state can turn fear into policy and memory into weapon. It proved that power can become more effective when it is written down, measured, repeated, and displayed. But Assyria also shows the limit of fear. Fear can win obedience. It can make kings bow. It can silence cities. It can make tribute flow. It can build palaces. It can last for generations. But fear does not heal resentment. It does not create deep loyalty. It does not make conquered peoples pray for your survival. It does not make Babylon forget destruction. It does not make deported families love the road. It does not make rivals mourn when your walls fall. When Assyria weakened, the world did not rush to save it. Too many people had waited too long for revenge. That is the final political lesson. An empire built mostly on fear must remain feared forever. The moment fear breaks, the empire has little love to fall back on. Still, we should not reduce Assyria's fall to moral punishment alone. History is rarely that clean. Assyria also fell because of overextension, succession struggles, military exhaustion, powerful enemies, Babylonian resurgence, Median strength, and the difficulty of controlling a vast empire. It fell because its structure was under pressure. It fell because even efficient machines wear down. It fell because strong kings do not live forever, and systems dependent on constant force can weaken quickly when the center falters. Moral hatred helped bring enemies together, but strategy, timing, geography, and politics mattered too. As a sleep history story, Assyria leaves us with one of the most haunting endings in the ancient world. The empire begins as a city of merchants and priests beside the Tigris. It grows through trade, survives domination, hardens through insecurity, becomes a kingdom of warriors, transforms into an empire under Tiglath-Pileser III, reaches across the Near East under Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, conquers cities, invades Egypt, destroys Elam, humiliates Babylon, builds Nineveh, gathers the library, and then collapses in fire when Babylon and the Medes strike back. It is a story shaped like a warning. Now imagine the final image. Not the battle, not the kings, not the siege. Imagine the ruins long after everyone is gone. The Tigris moves under a quiet sky. Grass grows over broken walls. The palaces of Nineveh are buried beneath mounds. The lamassu sleep in darkness. The library tablets lie cracked but waiting. No envoy trembles in the halls. No king hunts lions. No army marches from the gates. No tribute procession enters the palace court. The empire that once made the world hold its breath is silent. Then, thousands of years later, a hand clears dust from a tablet. A sign appears, then another. The dead empire speaks. It speaks of conquest, yes, it speaks of terror. It speaks of kings who believed Ashur had given them the world, but it also speaks of omens, prayers, medicine, stars, myths, dictionaries, rituals, floods, friendship, grief, and the search for eternal life. Assyria returns not only as a warning, but as an archive of human complexity. That is why we remember it tonight, not to admire its cruelty, not to excuse its terror, but to understand how a small city became a machine of empire, how fear can build order, how order can become violence, how violence can create enemies, and how even the strongest walls eventually meet the day they cannot hold. The Assyrians wanted the world to remember their power. The world does remember. But perhaps not in the way they intended. We remember the armies, but also the victims. We remember the kings, but also the fall. We remember Nineveh's glory, but also its ashes. We remember Ashurbanipal's library, but also the lesson hidden inside Gilgamesh. No king lives forever. No city stands forever. No empire rules forever. Only memory remains, and memory is never fully under the control of kings.